I watched a lot of movies in 2022, and to pretend like that was a worthwhile time expenditure, I decided to articulate my thoughts on every single new release that I saw. I'm considering movies for this list based on mainstream American theatrical or streaming releases. So there might be films that only played at festivals in 22, or got a limited release in a single New York theater or something, and those will not be on this list. Conversely, there might be movies that had a festival or otherwise limited screening in 21 that are eligible. The way this is going to work is that I'm going to go through my top 10 first, and then count backwards from 11 all the way to my least favorite film of the year. Keep in mind, this is a roughly ordered list. I think that worrying about precisely organized categorization is a really good way to suck the fun out of watching movies. Also, keep in mind, these are my opinions. So if you disagree with anything I said, just remember, everyone gets something different out of a piece of art. And also, I don't owe you anything. This video is already going to be unreasonably long, so I don't want to waste any more time. So let's just jump into it at number 10.
Number 10, it's the Northman, baby.
This is peak socially masculine cinema, the kind of movie your dad would watch and then post a screenshot of one of the scenes on his Facebook page with no caption. Studios should make more movies like this. I don't care how much money they don't make. This movie cost $90 million, and it's a historical epic made by the guy who made The Witch. It shows. If I ever meet Robert Eggers, I'm going to ask him what his deal is with brown and gray. He's one of the best in the game at working with those two colors, but they really are the only ones he knows about. It's honestly a miracle that this movie doesn't look like muddy, unfocused garbage, because based on the color palette, it really should have. But it actually looks great. It suits the violent narrative really well. Everything looks grungy and filthy, but it matches the tone of this revenge story, and it's also clearly a meticulously constructed crime. This movie works so well because of how unapologetic it is about its nature as an epic myth. It always takes itself seriously and treats its themes, narrative, and spiritual elements with grim severity and immediacy. Nothing is flinched at. Violence is proudly shown on screen without fanfare or exaggerated choreography. It's just animalistic slaughter. I know it's a product of the fact that something of this scope could never have been made on this budget without at least some measure of overly cautious studio hand-wringing and pushback, but I wish they'd been able to go even further, more subversive and shocking. Obviously, it's just Hamlet, or rather an earlier version of the same story, but it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel to be good. Sometimes things can just retell the same story with a new vision, and that's more than enough. Also, Willem Dafoe plays an insane guy for like 5 total minutes, which is exactly the kind of performance he was built for.
Number 9, it's Decision to Leave, baby.
Straddles the line between a romantic drama and a police procedural, drinking deeply from both wells. This movie is very romantic, in the sense that the involved parties don't know how to not be insane, and therefore settle into a relationship that can only be sustained by escalating poor choices on both ends. It's a cat and mouse murder plot, where both the cat and the mouse have become hopelessly addicted to the dynamic. There's nowhere for it to lead but tragedy, and right when it feels like everything is going to collapse, it reveals an entire second act full of new tension and new ways for characters to fuck themselves up. The editing in this is downright astonishing. I didn't know you could even make movies that flowed like this. It heightens the headspace of the characters' neuroses, creating a scattered and unhinged viewing experience. It perfectly represents the mental state of the viewpoint character. The closest I've ever seen a movie come to using Homer Simpson's idea of star wiping every shot. Gorgeous, gorgeous lighting and camera work too. Every single moment is incredible to look at. The actual plot was a little too labyrinthine for me to completely follow, but I mostly understood it, and I think an eventual rewatch will clarify things. I don't think it detracts from the movie for this to be the case. I'd rather it not hold my hand and let me get a little lost than to slow down to make sure I can catch up. And the emotional beats still hit like a freight train either way. I left this one feeling shattered. More movies should be made like this.
Number 8, it's Aftersun, baby.
There was a point about halfway through this movie where I realized, oh, this is gonna make me cry, isn't it? And I was right. Twice, actually. Once at the end of the movie, and once 40 years from now when my dad dies in real life. It's a movie where nothing really happens. It just shows this relationship between father and daughter as they take this quiet vacation together. It made me remember the vacations I've taken with my own family and the transient nature of the friendships you make with the people you'll never see again on those trips. The moment in this movie that sticks out to me the most, among a great many impactful scenes, is a small couple of shots. The two main characters are relaxing at the pool, and the father notices a tired parent grab his screaming son by the wrist to try and drag him away. It then cuts to their hotel room, where he's teaching his daughter how to break away from someone if they grab her by the wrist. It's such a simple, real feeling moment. The movie never builds up to anything climactic. There's no dramatic event or major paradigm shift or hero's journey, so these small, intimate scenes really stand out because all the meaning and purpose of the film lies within them. People talk about the under pressure scene a lot when they discuss this movie, and that's a great emotional peak, but it stands on the shoulders of every tiny interaction and moment before it. Time is flimsy, and so is the childhood perception of adult authority and experience. Sometimes you don't realize that the adults around you were flawed figures until much later, and the things they say and do only make sense when you learn that everyone's just winging it. Is it fair to hold their failures against them when they were flying without a checklist? Aftersun is gonna stick with me for a while. I highly recommend people go watch it, and in the meantime, I need to go call my parents.
Number 7, it's Funny Pages, baby.
I am so fucking grateful that I watched this movie in my early 20s instead of my late teens. There were only 2 years difference between me and the main character of this film, but those 2 years were enough for me to establish myself in the world, just enough to look at these characters and go, thank fuck I didn't do it like that. Funny Pages is a grimy, mean spirited coming of age story about an aspiring cartoonist who rejects his wealthy, comfortable upbringing and embraces the shittiest, most disgusting living conditions and mentorship imaginable in pursuit of his dream. It would be admirable if he wasn't so selfish, and if he wasn't a prick even to the few people who do truly support him. In that sense, it's a remarkable portrait of the kind of person who doesn't usually get this sort of spotlight. The kind of person who feels like they're owed success, simply because they're talented, or because they've worked hard, or because they met a guy one time who knows another guy. Some all-time performances in this one. Wallace, the mentor character, is especially a sight to behold. A bizarre, mean-spirited little man who lets petty grievances dictate his life. In any other movie, he'd learn a lesson about acceptance and anger management or whatever, but in Funny Pages, he's somehow worse off for interacting with these people. In a sea of selfish assholes, he manages to stand out by being the most selfish and assholish, and in the end, he's just left irritated by the events of the story. Truly incredible stuff. He gets a lot of the best jokes, too. This movie feels physically sensible in a way very few movies do. You can feel the claustrophobic heat and cum-soaked stench of the shithole apartment. You can smell the mildew of the comic shop and feel the shitty weak fan failing to blow away the heat of 100 sweaty nerds in a too small space. It's gross and filthy in a way that you can taste on the back of your throat, and the movie is all the better for it. I don't think it would work nearly as well as a cynical subversion of typical coming-of-age storytelling if it wasn't so palpably covered in that greasy residue. Funny Pages stuck with me after watching it. It is an impressively mean-spirited piece of work that's clearly spoken from the heart, with great humor, incredible characters, and a bunch of the oddest, sweatiest-looking dudes ever filmed. Highly recommend it.
Number 6, it's Nope, baby.
It's one thing to celebrate the craft of filmmaking. It's another thing to celebrate the craft of blockbuster filmmaking, to emulate the style of legendary crowd pleasers like Steven Spielberg and create a genuine spectacle. Tonally, this is Jordan Peele's Jurassic Park, a little bit scary, a little bit funny, but above all exciting and wondrous. It's an homage to grandiose cinematic science fiction while being itself an excellent example of it. And yet, the real focus of this film's honoration is the people at the bottom of the totem pole, the lowly crew workers and animals who shoulder the brunt of filmmaking's hardship. What's especially impressive about Nope is how thematically dense it is. It spends a significant chunk of its runtime ruminating on the exploitation of people and animals in the entertainment industry, on the commodification of tragedy, and on the incessant human desire to catalog and immortalize even the worst things we see. All of these ideas interlock so tightly throughout the runtime that it is nearly impossible to consider them separate by the end. Every character is affected by the events of the story, but they can't help but try and understand and document it, even if it means getting so close they risk death. The build-up is a little sluggish, with the first half containing a lot of exposition and character stuff that doesn't feel propulsive, but when it does finally come together, it is spectacular. Several of the most impressive moments of the year are in this movie, some real fist pump moments. Some people classify it as a horror movie, and I think your mileage may vary, but I didn't find it especially scary. I would classify it more as thrilling or adventurous. But then again, I'm not really scared of aliens or tight spaces. Even if you are, though, I'd still highly recommend that you watch this movie.
Number 5, it's everything everywhere all at once, baby.
It's nice to see a chaotic, weird movie that isn't, for lack of a better term, overly Reddit about its quirkiness. Sure, there's a lot of comedy in this movie that treads into OMG so random territory, but it feels much more closely related to like 2012 YouTube skit humor than lay epic bacon discussion forum humor. But none of that really matters because drawing a line between this movie and any internet subculture's comedic sensibilities is very much putting the cart before the horse. This film is absolutely its own thing stylistically, and the absurdist humor is just one of several balls it's keeping in the air. I think that when it's best utilized, comedy leaves you defenseless. When you're engaged in sincere laughter, you're not paying attention to your guard walls, and it's easier to receive emotions other than mirth, too. Serious emotional moments hit so much harder when you're primed for silly ones, and this movie is especially good at weaving both of those into and through each other. I can count on one hand the number of times I've simultaneously laughed and cried during a movie, and this is one of them. I think, reflecting on the film a year later, the emotional core isn't actually particularly groundbreaking or special, and even slides into trite and vacuous at points, but I don't actually care even a little bit. It is absolutely taking the path more traveled by to mention the rock scene, but come on, I'm not made of stone. That scene alone more than makes up for any Pinterest board aphoristic power of kindness stuff this movie has. The action is also great. It's visually creative and kinetic in a way very few movies being made in the Western Hemisphere today are. It's obviously inspired by classic kung fu movies, which is great because tightly choreographed hand-to-hand combat is cinematic catnip to me. Michelle Yeoh truly is one of the best to ever do it. Combined with the wild editing and some insane camera angles, and you've got some of the best action scenes of the year. Truly inspired stuff, the sort of thing that amateur filmmakers are going to be homaging for years. If there's one thing I wish the movie had done more of, I would have liked to see it lean harder into the science fiction aspect. The Matrix inspirations are obviously there, but it doesn't live up to them, because a big part of what made The Matrix so good is how hard it leaned into the technology and the implications of it. In that sense, I think this movie sort of fails at being a genre film, even if it succeeds in so many other areas. I think out of all my favorite movies this year, this is the one that I'd be the least surprised by someone else despising. It is totally understandable that someone might come out of this movie thinking that its emotional beats were sophomoric or unconvincing, or that the humor is too zany and juvenile, or that the Asian diasporic representation is insultingly tropey. Some of those I disagree with. Others I'm culturally unequipped to address. But they're all extremely valid responses to the film. For my part, though, I strongly clicked with it, and I found it to be an extremely fun watch that stuck with me for a long time afterwards. Every criticism is probably correct, but I think it's a great film anyways.
Number 4, it's Tar, baby.
Cate Blanchett gives the performance of a career as Lydia Tarr, a world-famous conductor at the top of her game, and follows her abrupt fall from grace as skeletons start to spill out of her closet. As the movie progresses, you can feel the walls closing in and her carefully constructed life collapse under the weight of its own lies. It's a nuanced examination of power dynamics and accountability, told through the lens of a specific woman who's never had to answer for her actions before, and held together by an unbelievably compelling lead performance that had me captivated for the entire runtime. Lydia Tarr herself is an exceptionally well-rounded and complex character, and by telling the entire narrative from her perspective, it really feels like she's a fully fleshed out human being that exists in real life. Tar is an extremely fascinating character to dissect and analyze, probably the most compelling character of the year in that sense. Every action, every scene is just begging to be scrutinized, to dig deep into the power dynamics present in every relationship she has. Everyone who's ever said anything about this movie has brought up the classroom scene towards the beginning, and it is an excellent scene. But really, every other moment is just as complex and interesting. The character facet that intrigues me the most, personally, is her insistence on being considered not just equal to, but as a man in her public image. She abhors the gendered language that separates maestros from maestras and prefers that she be referred to by the masculine term. It goes far enough that when she threatens her daughter's bully, she refers to herself as the girl's father rather than her mother. What that means to the narrative at large is up to interpretation, but it's remarkable how much characterization there is to chew on. Something else that really impressed me is how little this movie holds the audience's hand. When a character speaks in a foreign language, there are no subtitles. When a character talks about art or music, no one translates it to layman speak. It's a ballsy choice that might make the movie less accessible, but it makes you an observer, looking through a porthole into a world that the focus character already understands completely. Why should you then expect your lack of knowledge to be buttressed? My least favorite thing about the movie might be the psychological elements, the ghosts that plague the backgrounds. I don't think they service the narrative of the film very well, but it's a minor complaint in the face of the quality of the rest of the movie. Tar is a deeply fascinating, multi-layered movie with a lead performance so good I'm not totally convinced Lydia Tarr isn't somehow a real person. An all-time great character study on the same tier as There Will Be Blood or Raging Bull.
Number 3, it's Crimes of the Future, baby.
I've watched this movie a few times since it came out, and I'm really glad I did, because this movie has percolated in my brain like no other this year. It might be the movie that stuck with me the most from 22, the one I spend the most nights lying awake thinking about, which is surprising, because when I watched it the first time, my takeaway was that it was just okay. But the more I thought about it, the more it dug into my mind. There's just something about this premise of a human species that no longer feels pain and turns to graphic and extreme body modification as a form of art and self-expression. It's a deeply evocative concept. Our bodies are what we make of them, and even after the most extreme changes, they continue to be us, sometimes even more so than before. There's so much to unpack about this movie, from its typical Cronenbergian fascination with the intersections between sex, violence, and entertainment, to its dystopian, decaying society. The old world is dying, and if we don't change with it, we won't last long enough to see what comes after. No amount of clinical categorization or political pressure can change the fact that the only way forward is to embrace the new flesh. The way I see it, the only real crime of the future is resisting it. If I have any problem with this movie, it's the ending. I feel like if it had ended 10 minutes sooner or 20 minutes later, it would have been perfectly fine, but the last few scenes opened up a lot of unanswered questions that I wasn't even thinking about asking in the first place. The actual final moment is fantastic and caps the movie off perfectly, but the 2 or 3 scenes before that just left me a little unsatisfied. Still though, this movie is grafted onto my brain, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon, so I think it would be doing it a disservice to call it anything less than great. The most literal interpretation possible of an artist revealing himself to his audience.
Number 2, it's Mad God, baby.
I fucking love stop motion animation. Cannot get enough of it. It is my favorite form of animation, bar none. And a huge part of that is how tactile and real it obviously is. You can see the human craftsmanship between every frame, the fingerprints on the models, and the way that strands of hair are disturbed during repositioning. There's distinctly human evidence left behind as part of the creation process that cannot be polished away, and that's what's so compelling about stop motion to me. So when I learned that the actual fucking god of the medium, Phil Tippett, was finally releasing his magnum opus, I made it my damn preeminent objective to see it in theaters. And let me tell you, it was downright rapturous. I have truly never seen something so visceral, so bleak and hellish. It's the closest thing I can imagine to actually peering into someone's brain directly while they're having a horrible nightmare. Not just a nightmare in the sense that the visuals are surreal and disturbing, but in that the actions of this world's inhabitants operate on an inscrutable, dreamlike logic. It only makes sense in that they're able to continue navigating this hellscape without being swept up into one of its many dangers. Because of its surreal nature, or maybe just as a byproduct of it, Mad God barely has a real narrative structure. It suggests a plot, but the best anyone can do is develop a vague notion of what anything specifically means or what anyone in this world is trying to accomplish. What little story does exist seems mostly just an excuse to thread together this series of disturbing images that make up this movie. The assassin whose journey we follow merely provides a window into this profane world. The atrocities here have happened before, and they continue to happen even after the focus pivots to the next environment. Story takes a backseat to sightseeing. That's going to turn a lot of people away from this film, but when the visuals are this creative and this technically impressive, I couldn't give less of a shit. I wanted this to last for 7 fucking hours. The thing that really strikes me about the world of Mad God is how uncaring it is. There isn't a single living thing in this world that isn't suffering, and there's no reward for their misery. Slave workers are accidentally smashed by the same machinery that created them. Squabbling creatures are crushed by the boot of a much larger being that doesn't even notice them. And a hallway of giants are constantly electrocuted so their feces can feed a bloated, immobile face. It's a Moschian depiction of hell, except that this torture isn't really for the sake of divine punishment. At least, not anymore. This broken world doesn't even care enough to have a reason to punish its residents. It's just collapsed on itself to such a degree that this is the only reality that could possibly still exist. Any criticism I could possibly have for this pales in the face of the fact that it is the 30-year magnum opus of one of the most revolutionary masters of the medium. Even if I were to complain about, say, the live-action segments, it's not my masterpiece and it's not my vision. The only person this movie was really made for was Phil Tippett, and the fact that any of us were allowed to glimpse into his brain like this at all should feel special. It's unlikely I'll ever see something like this again in my lifetime, and that kinda kills me.
Number one, it's the Banshees of Inisherin, baby.
One of my biggest fears as I become a full member of society with a mailing address and a full-time job is that one day I'm going to wake up and realize that all my closest relationships have irreparably deteriorated without me noticing. So you can imagine that this movie hit me very hard in a very specific way that I was only kind of prepared for going in. I expected it to make me feel things. What I did not expect was that 3 goddamn weeks after watching it on my way home, I'd start crying and have to pull into a parking lot because I couldn't stop. The Banshees of Inisherin juggles a lot of themes and ideas, but the one that sticks out to me the most is a simple one. Is it better to be liked by your peers or to be remembered by history? The two main characters stand at opposite sides of this question, and it's tearing their friendship apart. Already torn it apart, actually, though one of them doesn't realize it. For my money, I think it's better to be liked. If you leave a positive impact on the people close to you, is that not a good enough legacy to leave behind? Calm doesn't seem to think so, but he's a small-minded musician trapped on a tiny island. I'm making this movie sound bleak and sad, and it is, but it's also darkly hilarious, and it manages to juggle tragedy and comedy like so many knives, but it never cuts itself on them once. Every line of dialogue is purposeful and whip-smart, whether it's a witty one-liner or a devastating emotional monologue, and believe me, there's a bunch of both. It's honestly one of the funniest movies of the year, a sort of dry humor based on the interactions between 2 or more people. There's almost no joke that isn't built on character interactions, and that's a really hard thing to do well. It's not just the writing that makes this my favorite film of the year, though. The look of the thing is immaculate as well. This little pastoral island feels like such a cozy, intimate, fucking boring place to live. It matches the mood perfectly. A gray haze hangs over the environment, and all the dull greens and blues of the landscape and the ocean go a long way to making this quaint lifestyle feel bleak and one note. And everyone's warm outfits look so natural and comfortable. Everything about the vibes really makes me forget that I'm watching actors and not real people. Honestly, if there's anything I could criticize about this film whatsoever, it's that the soundtrack can be a bit repetitive. But that's it. Everything else is honed to damn near perfection, making for one of the most compelling, evocative, heartbreaking, and worthwhile films I've seen in years.
Now we're done with the top 10. It's time to count down to the bottom. Starting with number 11, it's Saloum, baby.
Saloum is composed of 2 genres colliding with each other at highway speeds. The first half of the movie is a delightfully charming, Western-esque thriller with precisely crafted dialogue, and the second half is a hard pivot into supernatural horror, apparently inspired by Senegalese folklore. It's a gambit, to be sure. You're inevitably going to have a lot of people who thought one half was great, but the other was trash, and that it squandered its potential by trying to merge them. You may think that the 2 genres would go together like oil and water, but it's much more like flint striking against steel. They don't gel, they aren't integrated smoothly at all, but it's all about the ensuing flames. The overall production value of the film is impressive, considering the low budget. Though the supernatural special effects were kind of distractingly bad at points, the majority of the movie is really well shot. There's an impressive mastery of tension building on display here, too, especially in the sign language dinner table scene. Fantastic moment. It escalates throughout the movie with only a few stutters, and by the time all hell breaks loose in the second half, it has firmly welded the accelerator to the floor for the entire remainder of the runtime. Which, by the way, only totals to about 85 minutes, so by necessity, its pacing is tight as a drum. As far as the characters go, they're mostly quite simple and don't get fleshed out much over the runtime, but they're compelling enough to carry their part of the narrative, and their camaraderie is very believable. I truly bought them as a squad that had worked together multiple times in the past. The actors all did a great job, really impressive work from all the leads, helped sell the characters as well as the revenge plot that serves as the movie's backbone. Like with a lot of foreign movies, my lack of context inevitably warps my perspective a little bit. I don't know a goddamn thing about Senegalese geopolitics or folklore, but I hope it didn't impact my enjoyment too much. All I know is that this movie is remarkably bold, ambitious, and imaginative.
Number 12, it's RRR, baby.
I understand that this isn't highbrow cinema. I recognize that there are thoughtful, provocative, and masterfully crafted films by other Indian filmmakers this year that I did not see. I am fully aware that S.S. Rajamouli is a blockbuster filmmaker who appeals to the masses with spectacular but unchallenging films. And most importantly, I know that this kind of movie, despite forming perfectly to the Western perception of Indian action, is not representative of the entire region's filmography. It's probably closer to our own Marvel movies, honestly. I don't care. This is one of the greatest big-budget blockbuster experiences of the year. Just an endless stream of holy shit moments for 3 straight hours. To call this amusement park cinema would not be inaccurate, but that's not a bad thing. What is an amusement park, after all, but a venue to generate easy emotions? Every part of a roller coaster is engineered to automatically elicit excitement and adrenaline, and this sort of multi-million-dollar action spectacle is no different. Even the crappiest spy thriller or superhero schlock can create cheap thrills, but RRR goes well above and beyond the Call of Duty to create one of the most intense and wild viewing experiences possible. But even I, a well-known lover of insane bullshit, would have been tired of it after 3 hours if it wasn't held together by an extremely compelling friendship at the core of the film. The two leads have such a powerful bond that it warps the entire narrative around them, and leads to some of the coolest moments in the whole thing. The dance sequence somewhere in the middle of the film fucking rules so hard, as anyone who's ever seen the movie will happily tell you multiple times, but there's really just so many standout moments, and there's an unstoppable romance at the heart of all of them. Obviously, being a white guy from America, I'm not well equipped to speak on the politics of this movie or the portrayal of historical figures in such an exaggerated way, so I feel like my enjoyment of the film does need an asterisk next to it. I'm not an Indian nationalist or anything, I'm just ignorant. I'm inclined to think of it as some kind of Inglourious Bastards-esque heightened alternate reality, but I'm not going to make a hard statement on that because I don't think it's my place to, as someone who doesn't know the first thing about Indian cinema. On its own, though, as a breakout international hit from a movie industry underexplored in the Western world, it kicks infinite ass. God, I love quality maximalist cinema.
Number 13, it's Top Gun Maverick, baby.
I have no love for the US military, or their propaganda, or the original Top Gun, so it's a little painful for me to admit how much I enjoyed Top Gun Maverick. It's the same kind of internal dilemma that drives Hideo Kojima, between being staunchly anti-war and generally anti-military, and fighter jets just being the coolest shit ever. To that point, I think this movie is at its cinematic best when the planes are in the air. They simply don't look real in motion. They genuinely look like there's an invisible 10-year-old's hand swooshing them around. The fact that they were able to capture the power and swiftness of these engineering marvels on camera feels nothing short of miraculous. The dogfights, hell, all the flight scenes, are some of the most dynamic and intense ever put to film because of how much care went into capturing the speed, strength, and maneuverability of these planes. On the ground, the movie pivots to a different focus, the steadfast refusal to pass the torch and carry the legacy of Top Gun to a new generation. Tom Cruise would have people believe that he's the last of his kind, a movie star from a different age of Hollywood. And his character in this movie is a relic in the same exact way. As military aviation pivots away from fighter jets and towards unmanned drones, the skies have no place for ace pilots anymore. The future is here, but the heroes of the past aren't ready to retire. So where does that leave them? Well, in the case of Maverick, the movie makes it clear, both on the ground and in the air, that he is the best of the best. Utterly irreplaceable. No pilot comes close to matching his flight skill, no other character can match his charisma and gravitas. He is, in every sense of the word, the main character of this entire world. The best anyone else can hope for is to be a footnote in his life story. The best pilot other than him shoots down barely half of the bogeys Maverick does. It's pretty funny to consider on its own, but the truth is, Tom Cruise really is reaching the end of his career, and nobody's going to replace him when he's gone. That fact resonates through the fuselage of this entire film. I think it's fair to say that Top Gun Maverick might be the most expensive vanity project any human has carried out in the last century. It is self-indulgent propaganda, not just for the US military, but for Tom Cruise, the greatest movie star of all time, or so it would have you believe. And because of that self-indulgence, it soars to become one of the greatest blockbuster experiences in a very long time. There aren't too many movies that I'm genuinely grateful I saw in theaters, but I think it was so worth it for Maverick. The action set pieces, especially the whole final half hour, wouldn't hit nearly as hard and sound nearly as good on a home theater. And it wouldn't do right by Cruise's one-man crusade to save cinema if I just waited to rent it on Blu-ray.
Number 14, it's Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, baby.
It's really a testament to the cultural impact of Shrek that even 20 years later, a side character can get his own spin-off, and then get a sequel to that spin-off and have it do this well and be this good. They did not need to go this hard for the second Puss in Boots movie, but I'm so glad they did. It's maybe the best looking movie in the Shrek universe, with some really vibrant and kinetic animation with a distinct storybook-esque art style. It looks more watercolor than the classic Shrek films, and I think it drives home the adventurous feel of the movie. Not to mention the great characters, especially the villains. With 3 different sets of antagonistic forces, I thought this movie might be overly crowded, but they all serve different purposes, and they get enough screen time to make each of them stand out. It's nice to see mainstream children's movies with unapologetically evil villains, unsympathetic and cartoonishly violent criminals who exist to cause unrepentant chaos. We don't get nearly enough of those. Something that sets Puss in Boots apart from the named and numbered Shrek movies is that it plays the fairy tale tropes a little straighter, rather than constantly lampooning them. It makes for more straightforward storytelling with a lot of room for sincerity, though in this case I do think that the plot was the weakest part of the movie. It's mostly just a standard story about morality and true desires, something hundreds of actual fairy tales have already been told about, and it doesn't twist them into any new or interesting ways. It's an unfortunate blemish on a movie that is otherwise so consistently excellent in its visuals and its characters, but it's not enough for me to call The Last Wish anything less than quite good. Also, when I saw the marketing, I thought for sure that the horrible little dog was going to completely tank my enjoyment, but he was astonishingly tolerable. I even liked him by the end. He had some funny moments, some endearing moments, and he was never pushed too far to the forefront. Congratulations, DreamWorks. You've escaped my anthrax envelopes for another film release.
Number 15, it's Avatar, The Way of Water, baby.
Every time James Cameron releases a new movie, about 6 months before it actually comes out, there's a lot of buzz about how it's the most expensive movie ever made, and it's gotta be like the 4th highest grossing film of all time just to break even. Can he really make that much on a feature film again? And then the movie comes out and it makes even more money than that. It's all part of his creative process at this point. The Way of Water is an obvious successor to the first movie, not just in the fact that it's a direct sequel, but in the sense that it attaches clumsy, heavy-handed storytelling to some of the most gorgeous, technologically advanced visuals ever put to the screen. These movies aren't just stories, they're demonstrations of the absolute bleeding edge of what computer graphics of their respective time periods are capable of. The first Avatar looked amazing when it came out, and The Way of Water blows past it to achieve an uncanny, incredible sense of realism. I suspect there must have been black magic involved because this shit looks more real than actual water. This movie is at its best when it leverages those advanced graphics to show the beautiful, expansive world of Pandora, and it takes huge amounts of the runtime to basically give us a National Geographic documentary about the sea people's way of life, the native flora and fauna. By taking so much time to set up the culture and natural beauty of this place, it makes it all the more impactful when the colonists come with their advanced weaponry intent on destroying it. The final act is a spectacle of destruction, both natural and mechanical annihilation that I wouldn't trust anybody but Jim to depict. It's a great finale, a massive, extended climax that makes all the build-up worth it. Just pure gas all the way to the end. I hope they give Payakan a gun in the next one. I will say, something that did not resonate with me about this film was the extremely strong emphasis on the nuclear family. For a movie so deeply rooted in anti-colonialism, environmentalism, respecting nature, its views on family are surprisingly traditional and conservative. Did not really participate in that. Also think it's a little weird how they completely sidelined the MacGuffin of the first movie, only to introduce a completely separate and unrelated MacGuffin. I think the whale juice actually works better than unobtainium narratively, but it's still kind of odd. The Way of Water feels like the culmination of everything James Cameron has been building towards his entire career. Every bit of his distinct filmmaking style, as well as the ideas he keeps coming back to in his projects and personal life, are present more than ever here. It's shocking that this is only the second part of 5, because it feels like his Sistine Chapel in a sense. He topped the first Avatar with this one, and I hope it just keeps getting better from here.
Number 16, it's bones and all, baby.
I spent a lot of this movie unsure of what to make of it. I thought that the romantic elements weren't meshed with the horror elements as well as they could have, and the road trip framing felt a little underutilized at points, but I was thoroughly won over by the end. What can I say? I like movies that amount to hanging out with some of the weirdest, grimiest characters imaginable and seeing a glimpse into their bizarre worlds. I'm also absolutely enamored by the idea of the Midwestern empty highway, as well as the grand American tradition of road trips. In that sense, this movie's vibes were intoxicating to me for long stretches. Some banger performances in this one. Mark Rylance plays one of the creepiest characters of the year. Just an absolute wacko. I'd put my house up for sale if he moved into my neighborhood. Timothy Chalamet and Taylor Russell are also, of course, fantastic. Everyone in this movie is just a total weirdo in several ways. It really drives home the loneliness of their lifestyle. It's a sad, melodramatic existence for all these people, and there's barriers even between others like them. This movie is immaculately shot, too. Every moment is just gorgeous. It's got a warm glow. The opening moments of the film are haunting because of how cozy the vibes are, right up to the moment bloody things start happening. And the graphic violence is shot in a careful, personal, almost beautiful way. It feels less like you're voyeuristically peering into this lifestyle, and more like you've been graciously invited to the table. I really like this film. It's brutal, gory, bittersweet, heartbreaking, and it's the only movie I've seen in theaters in recent memory that I didn't finish my popcorn for.
Number 17, it's Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, baby.
The stop motion is gorgeous and lovingly handcrafted. The twist of putting Pinocchio in fascist Italy is genuinely inspired, and Cate Blanchett plays a shrieking monkey. There's really a lot to love here. The Disney Pinocchio was already an abortion of filmmaking, but it somehow looks even worse in the face of this charming, twisted version of the story. Not to say that I actually saw the new one, I'm opposed to it in the same way I'm opposed to unethical dog breeding practices, but you know what I mean. This movie is extremely Del Toro in how it presents its themes and how it uses its setting to reinforce them. That man fucking loves using fascism as a backdrop for his stories, and while I don't think it works here as well as in Pan's Labyrinth, it's a refreshing change of pace for a story that's been told and retold in mostly the same way over the years. For a kids' movie, Pinocchio spends a hell of a lot of time showing the horrors of war, the evils of dictatorship, and the effects of grief. It's really nice to see such a candid portrayal of sadness and evil in a movie for a younger audience. Kids aren't fucking stupid, they don't need to be talked down to, and this movie is frank and sincere in its depictions of both bad and good in the world. Jiminy Cricket doesn't get much chance to shine in this film, his arc feels hardly fleshed out, and his ending doesn't seem especially earned to me. But he does have some of the best lines in the whole film, and at least has value as an Ian Malcolm-esque mouthpiece to shout the major themes directly at the audience. Pinocchio himself is a convincing young boy, and I didn't find his childish mannerisms too irritating. I also like that his introduction involves him crawling around on all fours like some kind of horror monster. I liked the movie a lot overall. It was surprisingly dark and morbid, but Del Toro's enthusiasm for life and generally happy demeanor shine through in all his works, and this one is far from an exception. Definitely recommend it, especially for that gorgeous, stunning stop-motion work.
Number 18, it's Jackass Forever, baby!
There's something truly special about the simplicity of the Jackass formula. I think laughing at someone getting hurt is just part of the hominid genome, and we've been kicking each other in the nuts for fun since the days of Australopithecus. That primal monkey brain is still in us somewhere, and every once in a while it's fun to regress to a baser, cruder type of being and laugh at people getting hurt. I guess what I'm saying is, I really doubt there's ever going to be a Jackass movie that's unenjoyable, simply because the human urge to watch someone get punched in the cock is occasionally one worth indulging. I indulged it for this movie, and it's probably the hardest I laughed at any film this year. It was pretty obviously supposed to be something of a passing the torch moment for the Jackass franchise, so they brought in a bunch of new folks that I think were just as fun as the old crew. I never knew how any of them were going to react, and that made some bits way funnier. I'm glad Johnny Knoxville is still involved, though. I don't necessarily need to see him be the one getting his ass kicked, it's just as fun to see him be the one pressing the button that kicks someone else's ass. His stage presence elevates this series a lot. He feels like the heart and soul of the whole thing, and I really don't think Jackass could survive without him. Also, for the record, my favorite bit was the electric floor tap dance. I loved that the guy playing the piano noticed there was a zapper on the throne and decided to be a good sport and sit on it anyways.
Number 19, it's Inu-Oh, baby!
Dear God, the animation in this movie fucks. Inu-Oh is a 14th century period piece with an anachronistic hair metal soundtrack. It's about a pair of outcasts finding companionship in each other and finding purpose in musical performance, which slowly heals the curse of deformity that plagues one of them. It is, if nothing else, deeply and thoroughly committed to this premise, to the point that it spends massive chunks of the runtime on long 10 to 20-minute performance pieces that are admittedly masterworks of animation, but also grind the plot to a halt. By the end of the movie, it's pretty much pivoted from having musical moments to straight up being a concert, which took some adjustment, but is ultimately a creative decision that I liked. Beneath the protracted musical segments are two narrative threads that run alongside each other. One is the tension between the protagonists' radical performances, which tell forgotten versions of stories that the elites have tried to stifle, and said elites who only want their approved version of history to be told. It's serviceable enough as the propelling force of the story and the source of dramatic stakes, but the real narrative standout is the dynamic between the two main characters. The way their friendship develops over the course of the film is nothing short of fantastic, and justifies the existence of the film all on its own. Though I'm not sure that it was actually the intention, I think it's pretty easy to view this movie through a queer lens as well. Given that it's a story about defying cultural standards and finding freedom and self expression told through the lens of two men who find connection in each other where the rest of society ignores them, I think it's a valid way to view the movie. I've especially seen a fair few trans people resonate strongly with this movie and its ideas about bodily transformation and the power of choosing one's own name. I'm glad it's appreciable on that axis. Overall, I'm really glad I saw this. It's one that I would encourage people to seek out, with the understanding that it is very non traditional in its storytelling. There's a lot of abstract stuff going on, and it has a very unusual structure. If you can stomach that, though, it is well worth watching.
Number 20, it's Prey, baby!
Predator fans may rejoice, for the second good Predator movie has finally arrived. This movie really understands what made the original work so well. When you're faced with such an overwhelmingly powerful foe, the only chance you have to survive is to be smarter and luckier than it. To that point, this movie gave us a compelling cat and mouse game between a Yautja trying to prove its worth in the hunt and a Comanche warrior trying to prove the same. So much screen time at the beginning of the movie is spent establishing Naru's familiarity with the land that it feels like it's a believable advantage she has against this alien. If she's smart and fast and cunning and leverages her knowledge of the terrain, she just might survive. That's the core of the Predator, and this movie understands it very well. The cinematography is surprisingly great for a direct-to-streaming movie like this. It really drew me into the landscape and sold the setting. The action was generally pretty rad. It's fun to see the Yautja slaughter a bunch of guys, and it's cool to see the Comanche warriors barely go toe-to-toe with it for brief moments. Some of the action looks a little floaty, for lack of a better word, but it's mostly believable. The elements of human connection in the story really elevated the tension, though. You care a lot more about the Comanche warriors dying because you see how much Naru cares about them dying. I think the biggest weakness of the movie is that the CGI animals, and to a lesser extent the predator itself, just look pretty cheap. The bear especially just did not look good. It was also totally unnecessary to show the gun from Predator 2 at the end. Like, who was wondering about the fucking gun's backstory? More than anything else, this movie made me want more Predator in period films. Give me the Predator in Sengoku era Japan. Let me see it go toe to toe with the World War II Allied forces. Hell, go all the way to prehistory and show me Predator versus Spinosaurus. But after Prey, the last thing I want for a while is seeing the Predator fighting people with automatic rifles.
Number 21, it's white noise, baby.
I'm not really sure what this movie's whole deal was, but I think I liked it. It's one of those movies I didn't especially love while watching it, or for a few weeks after, but over the course of the past year, it's continued to gnaw at me, my estimation evolving over time in a way very few movies have. There's a lot of complex ideas being unraveled here, and they're all examined through the lens of a very surreal world, characters, and premise. Existential dread permeates the whole thing, sometimes in hilarious ways and sometimes in tragic ways. There's a great moment in the first half or so where Adam Driver's character grapples with the idea of his own death, and his care provider explains that he's going to die of a specific illness, that he's going to live a long, happy, and full life with no side effects, but that it will, eventually and suddenly, kill him. It's a fantastic moment of both absurdism and tragic dread that exemplifies the best parts of this movie. Not all of it is handled so well, though. There are a lot of parts that really drag on, either being so absurd that they cease to have coherent meaning, or so pretentious and self-important that they cease to be interesting. In particular, the dialogue was really hit or miss for me. Apparently, a lot of it is lifted directly from the book, which I haven't read, and it generally feels like a theater performance, or a carefully orated speech. Conversations can be hilariously sharp, or they can be cluttered and aimless. The visuals are consistently great, though, really compelling in terms of both camera work and editing. The train explosion and the speech overlaid on top of it was a bizarre but extremely fascinating piece of filmmaking. Also, the moment where that guy woke up after getting shot and immediately after being told that he shot himself asked what point he was trying to make resonated with me a lot more than it probably should have.
Number 22, it's Emily the Criminal, baby.
I'm giving this one the Uncut Gems Medal of Honor, a special award that goes to the most stressful, all gas no brakes movie of the year. I'm used to seeing Aubrey Plaza in comedic roles, so it was cool to see her in such a serious, dramatic movie. She stars as Emily, an art school dropout who can't get a job due to a past criminal record. Unable to make enough money to pay her bills legitimately, she turns to crime and realizes she's actually quite good at it. Emily is a ferocious main character. Anytime she gets knocked down, she's instantly back up and swinging twice as hard, never playing defense no matter how high the stakes. It means that the story is constantly escalating in tension and in scope, by complete fault of the main character. This escalation kind of gets away from things by the end, though. I feel like the payoffs of the second half are somewhat uncoupled from the setups of the first half. Things just blow out of proportion by the end, in a way that doesn't feel like it totally supports the initial themes of low-income desperation. Still, though, I found this one of the most aggressive, intense movies of the year, and I really appreciated its full balls approach. I could not tear my eyes from the screen, and even though it had some issues, I came out of the movie feeling exhilarated.
Number 23, it's Neptune Frost, baby.
Some political art is rather easy to understand. It grabs you by the shoulders and stares you right in the eye, and clearly and obviously articulates its ideas and who it condemns. Others aren't so straightforward, instead creating emotions and conveying its beliefs through prose-like dialogue and dream-like setting, more akin to the feeling of poetry than conventional filmmaking. Neptune Frost is, for most of the runtime, the latter. It's almost inscrutable and incoherent in how it presents itself. A strong narrative structure and easily followed plot are pushed aside in favor of swirling, beautiful visuals and musical numbers working together to create a very specific but complex vision of techno-rebellion. It's an ambitious project that completely defies classification. Neptune Frost is, broadly at least, a story about revolution, about the people who are subjugated so that technology in other countries can thrive. It's a grim underbelly of a cyberpunk world, and one that's rather pertinent to current world African struggles. I really don't want to just lifelessly regurgitate the basic premise, but you gotta understand, it is hard to talk about this movie without just going, yeah, just go watch it, soak up the vibes, you'll see what I mean. I think something this experimental and this musical is always going to struggle a bit with pacing, and even at just 100 minutes, I feel like it dragged a little, but that is nowhere near a deal breaker for something this impressively conceptualized and this experimental. Besides, everything else, from the costume design to the music to the performances, was great. I would encourage anyone to check this film out.
Number 24, it's the Batman, baby.
It's surprising how much this movie leans into its murder mystery element. In a lot of ways, it has more in common with Seven than any of its superhero contemporaries. Batman actually spends a lot of time doing detective work in this movie, and even if that detective work mostly boils down to another character pointed out something obvious and that made something click into place, it's still nice to see Batman doing stuff other than punching goons. It's got a compelling and menacing villain to oppose him, too. The Riddler's always been one of my favorite Batman villains because he's an enemy that has to be outsmarted more than outmuscled. My point here is that this is equal parts a superhero film and generally solid mystery thriller. It's nice to see comic book movies lean into the territory of genre films. It gives them some spice. This is one of my favorite interpretations of the Batman character. At the end of the day, Batman is a dude in a bat costume who beats people up at night. It's a fundamentally unserious premise, and if you're not going to lean into that and do a brightly colored silly Batman, the least you can do is make him so self-serious that he comes off as pathetic. It's the opposite side of the Adam West coin. Robert Pattinson is such a pitiful wet rag of a human in this movie. He spends all day hunched over in his shitty gamer chair, and when he's forced to leave the house, he has to wear sunglasses because the light hurts his sensitive sad boy eyes. All the villains are perfect too. Paul Dano is an immaculate casting choice for the Riddler, and everything about Farrell's Penguin is perfect. These character interpretations are a lot of fun, and they fit the darker aesthetics without being overly brooding and edgy. The final act is a bit too unbelievable for me. The majority of the movie is pretty grounded, and the climax escalates the stakes to a degree that took me out of the movie. But it's not a deal breaker. It's still one of the best superhero movies we've gotten in a long time, a very worthwhile interpretation of Gotham and all its problems.
Number 25, it's Sonic the Hedgehog 2, baby.
There's no way I can review this objectively. I've been a lifelong Sonic fan, and I don't plan to stop anytime soon. It can be pretty hard being a fan of Sonic, watching one of your favorite franchises pump out regular content across multiple mediums and having so much of it not be that good. I still consume a lot of it like a good little capital bootlicker, but the reality is that a lot of Sonic media is only good within its own paradigm. These live action movies have been no exception. As movies you can watch, they're not that good. But I really like them anyways, because at the end of the day, all of my problems with them are overshadowed by the fact that I actually get to see one of my favorite childhood characters on a theatrical screen. Which makes it pretty annoying that so much of this movie focuses on its human characters. My biggest problem with the first movie was that it spent so much time on non-Sonic stuff. And while the sequel is a lot better about it, it still finds room for a few extended sequences featuring some of the new side characters that really don't matter and don't fit the tone of the rest of the movie. The wedding scene baffles me the longer I think about it. Why is it so long? It's like some kind of bad late night television sketch got dropped into the movie and they just edited around it. The exceptional case, of course, is Agent Stone. Eggman has had a lot of lackeys over the years, and Stone is maybe the best. The chemistry between Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles is where the movie really shines, though. They're all cute and charming, and just like in the games, their personalities and power sets play off each other really well. The voice actors all did an amazing job, too. I wish Sonic were characterized to be a little older and reference pop culture a little less, but I will take what I can get. And of course, Jim Carrey absolutely fucking rules as Dr. Robotnik. Again, this is really just an opportunity for me to watch live action, big budget versions of my favorite characters hang out and fight each other. So the fact that they've got good chemistry and personality is really important. And they do. The plot meanders a lot, but it comes together in a fun final act with plenty of cute fan service and some good character moments. I'm interested to see where they go from here. I'm trapped in this franchise like a roach in its corresponding motel. There's no possible way for me to get out. Like, yeah, it's algorithmic trash designed to crowd please as many fans as possible. I'm not an idiot. I'm just a sucker.
Number 26, it's weird, the Al Yankovic story, baby.
I'm pretty burned out on musician biopics after the last few years, so seeing one that made me feel anything other than tired was a welcome relief. It follows in the footsteps of movies like Walk Hard and Pop Star, but takes it a step further by being about a real, actual artist, which makes it even funnier, in my opinion. Despite not really looking remotely like the actual Weird Al, Daniel Radcliffe truly understands the kind of mischievous, mad genius energy he needed to bring to the table. What makes this movie unique as far as satire goes is that it's surprisingly uncynical. It spends less time trying to skewer the industry or the biopic genre, and more time trying to make jokes at the expense of Weird Al himself, his image, and the genre that he's chosen to carve a niche in. The jokes feel really good natured throughout, and what critical commentary of the industry that does pop up is made much funnier by its sparse usage. The meetings with the record executives absolutely rule, but if the whole movie was like that, I think it would detract. Not all of the humor landed for me, especially in some of the scenes where there's a lot of cameos, like the pool party. It started to feel a little Saturday Night Live. But for the most part, I thought the movie was hilarious. It's really incredible that it manages to carve out a unique place for itself in a world where Walk Hard already exists, but it really does feel like its own thing. Anyways, no hardware store, so 0 out of 10.
Number 27, it's bodies, 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 baby.
Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is a satirical murder mystery thriller that takes place over the course of a single night as a hurricane party descends into paranoia over the discovered corpse of one of the party guests. It's a solid, well crafted movie that doesn't do anything especially unique or outrageous, but it doesn't need to. It's content to be merely good, never striving for excellence, and being one of the better horror movies of the year by taking a measured, unencumbered stride to the finish line. I liked the lighting in this movie quite a bit. The amount of the film that was lit practically with phone cameras and glow sticks not only added to the tension, but gave each character a distinct silhouette based on their light sources. It's a clever way to navigate the problem of a totally black setting while still making characters recognizable. I also liked the ending quite a bit. I'm not going to spoil it because the entire film hinges on it, but it either works for you or it will really not work for you, and it worked for me. I didn't love the Gen Z satire. It's pretty toothless and mostly amounts to the language that socially conscious youngsters use is really annoying. I will admit the amount of vitriol Rachel Sennett managed to put into the phrase upper middle class was very funny. Still, though, it's possible I've just got my nose pressed up against the glass and can't truly appreciate satire that skewers my own current generation and time period, but it just didn't work for me most of the time. I was also not a huge fan of a lot of the horror set pieces. I thought the tension building was really well done, but the releases were less well crafted. A few cheap jump scares, a few hand to hand struggles that felt pretty weightless and low stakes. It just didn't quite coalesce for me. But all in all, I'm a sucker for a thriller set in a cramped location, and being only 90 minutes or so, this film doesn't ever outstay its welcome. Also, I've seen a lot of people talk about Rachel Sennett and Lee Pace in this movie, but my main takeaway as far as performances go is that I want to see Maria Bakalova in more films. She was great in this.
Number 28, it's Incantation, baby.
Found footage horror movies are always pretty hit or miss for me. I thought the Blair Witch Project and Noroi were phenomenal, but movies like Cloverfield and Paranormal Activity bounced off of me super hard. I went into Incantation with measured expectations because of this, and I was pleasantly surprised at how good it was. I think it could have stood to be maybe 10 minutes shorter, but overall I thought it was well put together, had a very solid framing narrative, and was legitimately pretty damn scary at moments. I don't really have trypophobia, but man, there's a lot of holes in this movie. Since found footage is such a thoroughly saturated genre that tends to retread the same tropes like an unadventurous eater ordering chicken tenders at every restaurant, they have to differentiate themselves with their mood and style more than any creativity in the storytelling. Incantation is particularly good at this. The atmosphere it creates is excellent, and it's got a high enough budget that it's not afraid to show things directly. There's no inference you have to make to understand what scary things are happening. It's more than happy to just show you the blood and the gore and the bugs. My biggest problem with the movie is that it's pretty confusing to track. The footage is split across 3 timelines, and it's difficult to tell which one you're tracking at any time. There's also some classic horror movie dumbassery, which really just goes to show that you shouldn't be exploring any horrible tunnels you find, no matter how much internet clout it might get you. And you especially shouldn't fuck with any spiritual or occult objects while you're exploring said horrible tunnel. On some level, you have to feel that your average horror protagonist brings most of their misfortune on themselves, even if through ignorance.
Number 29, it's the bad guys, baby.
I think there's something to be said for making a dyed-in-the-wool genre film for kids. The Bad Guys, for at least a decent percentage of its runtime, is an entertaining heist movie with charming characters, great animation and art direction, and an admittedly generic plot that is at least propulsive and hits all the major beats I want in a heist. It's no Inside Job or Ocean's 11, but it is something I could actually show a child without them asking me what the word fuck means 70 seconds in. There's value in that. But when this movie merges its little getaway car out of the pristine express lane of heist thrillers and into the congested 6-lane thoroughfare of standard kids movie stuff, it suffers a lot for it. You've got the mid-movie falling out and the climactic reconnection, the expansive and epic final sequence, and oh boy, fart jokes. If I saw this piranha on the street, I would push him into traffic. That stuff really dragged parts of the movie down for me, but then again, this movie isn't necessarily for me. And the parts that are good are really good. Like I said earlier, the art direction is great. It's super cohesive and stylized in a way that makes everything dynamic and interesting to look at. I really wish every animated movie these days put so much care into their character designs, their art style, and the dynamism of every scene. That said, did there have to be human characters in this movie? Couldn't they have made every character an animal and made the world feel a little more cohesive at no cost to the storytelling? Overall, though, pretty good. This was a great year for animation, so this ended up a little lower in my estimation compared to some other great stuff, but it's still a pretty worthwhile movie that plays in a genre you don't see very often in animation. To end on a stray thought, really weird that the snake was dressed like Raoul Duke for some reason. Who was that for?
Number 30, it's 3,000 years of longing, baby.
A surprisingly poignant film about two lonely people trying to find fulfillment in each other. I was expecting a fairy tale esque story with some psychedelic imagery, and while I got some of that, I was surprised at the mature storytelling that came paired with it. For most of its runtime, it focuses on two characters in a hotel room, and the long history of the Jinn as he tells stories about where he's been and of the women whose desires he's helped fulfill. He's a romantic, you see. With such a strong pair of actors at the center of this premise, it is shockingly compelling, despite the extremely restricted cast and minuscule setting. I found the first part of the movie to be a beautiful balancing act of character focused discussion, perfectly executed and diligently restrained. Once they leave the hotel room, though, the story starts to expand in scope and introduce new ideas and characters that sort of destroy the delicate balance of the first part of the film. It has its own charm, and I like the bittersweetness of the ending, but it feels like it barges through the complex character studies of the first act like a child running through a sandcastle. I really respect the attempt, though. These ideas would be difficult to cram into a runtime less than like 3 hours, and given more time to flesh out the last part of the film, I think it could have been a true masterpiece. As it stands, it's merely a charming story with great visuals and excellent characters, but a muddy transition between ideas towards the end sours me a little on it. I'm still probably going to go back and rewatch it again at some point. I really did find it mostly quite engaging. I'd encourage people to check it out.
Number 31, it's Bullet Train, baby.
You know subtlety? Well, so does Bullet Train, and it thinks it's for cowards. This movie is pure glitz, glamour, and violence. The fight scenes are fun and creative, the lighting and colors are dazzling. It's kind of Scott Pilgrim-esque, actually. The plot is needlessly complicated, and it's made even more complex by all these flashbacks that feel like a meaningless excuse to have a bunch of bullshit happen. But as someone who loves spectacular nonsense like Bayonetta, my reaction to anything that happened was always pretty much fuck it, why not? Every time this movie started to lose my attention, it's like it could sense it waning and kicked into a higher gear, culminating into a final act that is full of bullshit. Ryan Reynolds has a cameo in this movie, and the simple act of showing his face is clearly meant to be the joke in that scene, and that should tell you the humor sensibilities of this movie. Every character is basically a Pez dispenser filled with one-liners instead of brittle candy that tastes like dust, and whenever they open their mouth, a Pez-shaped snarky joke comes out. It's like edgy Deadpool humor, you know, holy shit nuggets and that sort of thing. Some of them land, a lot of them don't, but the movie is fast-paced enough that even if a lot of them miss, you don't have to wait too long for the next one. Generally, I think this style of humor is pretty unbearable, but it didn't actually sink this movie for me. I also thought it was neat how luck is more or less a quantifiable, reliable force in this world. Characters can plan around their excellent or terrible luck and lean on it to make their plans go smoothly. Obviously, fortune is a narrative conceit to propel the events of the story, but it's neat to see it so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of the narrative. Check it out if you can ignore every other aspect of a movie in favor of fun explosions. If you can't do that, I would avoid this movie even if you have to gnaw your leg off to do so. But I had a pretty fun time manually flipping the breaker in my brain and autopiloting the popcorn eating motion for 2 hours.
Number 32, it's Confess Fletch, baby.
The original Fletch movies were before my time, so I didn't really have any context for this movie going in. I'm not really sure if that improved or detracted from the experience for me. For most of the runtime, this felt like a vehicle to show John Hamm being funny and likable, and it certainly succeeds at that. I don't think he would have been my first choice to play a charming rogue with a knack for slipping into places unnoticed, but by the end I was won over. I want more John Hamm Fletch. There's like, what, 20 Fletch novels? Let's adapt all of them. He's clearly having fun. I really like the comedy in this movie. It hits a nice ratio of a bit of physical comedy and a lot of character driven banter. Ham bounces off all the secondary characters in really fun ways. I especially liked his sports team bickering with the police chief. The plot and the characters are really just a hat rack to hang the sombrero of comedy on, and the fact that the humor hit so hard for me means that I didn't care much that it hardly had any stakes or dramatic weight. Fletch never feels like he's actually in trouble. He's always got a clever quip ready, and he always manages to squirrel his way out of trouble without too much difficulty. It's a screwball approach, and that's not always my cup of tea, but I liked it here. There are a lot of worse ways to spend an afternoon than watching this movie. Even if it's not exactly the pinnacle of filmmaking, it's emblematic of something I want to see a lot more of, which is mid-budget character comedies. The days of Mike Myers dressing up in a funny outfit and saying absurd things feel like they're long gone, and Confess Fletch strikes me as the first step on a long road back to that glorious Eden.
Number 33, it's the Bob's Burgers movie, baby.
I've never actually sat down and watched Bob's Burgers, but I've seen a few episodes here and there, and I've really enjoyed what I've seen. I think that's one of the strengths of this movie, actually, that it's accessible to people who aren't big fans of the show and still manages to be really funny and entertaining, despite having very little context for these characters or setting. There's some really great jokes throughout the entire runtime, and every character is sharply written and memorable. I especially like the Fishoder family. All of them are just so goofy and bumbling in really funny ways. I do feel like it could have been 10 or 15 minutes shorter and not really lost much. The whodunit plotline lost a lot of steam as the story progressed. I feel like it was the least interesting part of the movie by far. These characters are just so much fun to watch aimlessly bouncing off each other that seeing them try to solve an actual high-stakes mystery felt, in some ways, less interesting than just watching them have dinner. My biggest disappointment by far, though, is the music. All the songs we did get were absolute bangers, and I would have loved to have at least one or two more. It almost feels like they forgot it was a musical halfway through. But the songs we did get slapped, so I'm kind of willing to take it for what it is. I can't help but like this movie. It's just fun. The Belchers are fun. This is probably the best adult animated TV to movie adaptation of the year. It's crazy that there's enough of them this year for that sentence to actually mean anything.
Number 34, it's Dead for a Dollar, baby.
Look, I don't actually care how good this movie is. It's fine, by the way. I really only care about getting to see Willem Dafoe and Christoph Waltz on my screen in a Western. The two of them are such incredibly gifted actors that I'd probably go out of my way to watch a toothpaste commercial that featured either of them. Dead for a Dollar feels like a movie stretched across eras, a classic Western made with modern technology by a man who's at the end of a very long and successful career. In some sense, it's just nice to see movies like this still being made with effort and care. Characters mostly serve as archetypal heroes, anti-heroes, and villains, but they're utilized well and are masterfully acted. The story is nothing special, but it serves as a solid foundation to build up to a good shootout. Nothing new is done here. Nothing new is even attempted. It's all just classic, iconic Western symbols and storytelling shot with a digital camera instead of a film one. On one hand, I'm glad that low-budget filmmaking is still alive and that the great filmmakers of last century are still able to create new things. On the other hand, when you don't even try to do something new and instead only shuffle around time-tested ideas, does it even count as creating at all? On the third, and maybe largest hand, this movie is ugly as shit, and whoever color corrected it should get drawn and quartered. I get that this movie was made on a tight budget and tight time constraints, but if you have the money for Defoe and Waltz, you have the money to hire a guy who knows the West isn't actually yellow all the time in real life.
Number 35, it's Ambulance, baby.
I'm not especially a fan of the guy, but I'll give Michael Bay credit. The man has an extremely strong, consistent, and recognizable visual style that elevates movies like this quite a lot. Nobody else could take such a simple premise and make something so kinetic and well realized. This is the kind of movie that's best watched in a theater, not because the massive screen and quality sound system improve it, but because the audience's reaction improves it. There were shouts and laughter and people pointing at the screen, and I think that's the best way to see something like this. They went wild for the drone shots, especially. The drone is basically a character unto itself. Michael Bay uses that thing like he invented it and is trying to get other cinematographers to buy one. Most Michael Bay movies have product placement for like Beats or Bud Light or whatever. This whole movie is product placement for camera drones. Obviously, this is basically Speed with a heist element, a premise that would be perfect for a 90-minute action thriller. But instead, we get a little over 2 hours of explosive ambulance action. It's pretty impressive that they don't waste that extra time on stupid bloat like meaningless side characters or aimless B-plots. It's pretty much all spent on more of the ambulance stuff and the core relationship between the leads. Not to say it doesn't drag, because it totally does, but it drags in a completely different way than you'd expect from something like this. Surprisingly good performances, too. Characters are fleshed out just enough to give some emotional stakes and prop up the whole narrative, though the cowboy flashback stuff sort of escaped me. Decent stuff overall. Pretty fun, propulsive, full of explosions. You can't ask for more with Bay in the driver's seat.
Number 36, it's Vengeance, baby.
Everything about this movie makes it seem like it should be the most insufferable piece of media possible. That one guy from The Office wrote, directed, and stars in this movie as an arrogant, disconnected podcaster trying to spin a story out of the murder of a girl he slept with once. It sounds like anathema to decent filmmaking, and yet somehow, this movie manages to leverage that premise and its narrow-minded prick of a protagonist into something actually pretty interesting and funny. It explores the thin line between engaging with tragedy and exploiting it for personal gain in a way that I really liked. I think true crime can really struggle to find that line, and that's a big part of why I don't consume much of it. Watching this character stumble through rural Texan life, trying to unlearn his internal New York-informed biases as he actually interacts with these gun-toting good old folks, was fun to watch. The rodeo at the middle of the movie, especially, was a very funny scene that perfectly exemplified just how much of a fish out of water he is. Now, whether or not it's an actual picture of life in the middle of Texan fucked nowhere, and whether it's meant to be a charming nod towards Texan culture or a snarky indictment of it, isn't really for me to say as someone who tries to avoid that state as much as possible. But I do think it's pretty obvious that it's shown through the lens of a character who spends his weekends in New York penthouse parties, so it should really all be taken with a grain of salt anyways. My biggest gripe is the ending. BJ Novak's character takes a turn right at the end that left me going, what the hell? In a bad way. All the themes and ideas about exploiting tragedy for internet clicks and cultural bias and elitism really kind of goes up in smoke in the last moments. It's honestly really frustrating to see such a promising movie snap its ankle right at the end.
Number 37, it's the Woman King, baby.
This movie created a massive shitstorm of discourse on the internet when it came out, and it's all a bunch of bullshit that I don't want to get involved with. I do think there's something to be said for responsibly and accurately portraying the villains of history, but I also think that the people who were angry about this movie's inaccuracies probably were not arguing in good faith. Braveheart's horribly inaccurate in a bunch of ways too, but a lot of people love that movie. The biggest prick in the thorn bush of angry Twitter users that surrounded this film, though, is the fact that it's actually pretty good. If it had been an incompetent piece of shit, I doubt it would have been nearly as controversial, nor would the conversation have persisted for so long. Since the movie's actually decent, though, it gets to bear the cross of discourse for as long as it's remembered. As far as the actual movie goes, it makes me happy that we still get historical epics like this one. I found that I liked it a hell of a lot more than I loved it, though. I thought the acting was serviceable, the fight scenes were satisfactory, and the story was compelling enough to carry the runtime, but there were never any moments that truly wowed me. I spent the entire film in a solid state of moderate entertainment, which is enough to make watching it worthwhile, but not really enough to elevate it above a lot of other blockbusters I liked more this year. It's like a roller coaster that never goes faster than 20 miles an hour. It's not very fast, but it's still a roller coaster, you know? It's still got all the pitches and hills, even if they're not very big. At the end of the day, African history isn't one that gets much of a spotlight in mainstream cinema, so even if it's a distorted Hollywood version of that history, it's still kinda nice to see. I hope we get more stuff like this, even if specifically this isn't exactly what I was hoping for.
Number 38, it's Hustle, baby.
My respect for Adam Sandler went up astronomically the moment I realized that he's not actually a hack with the acting skill of a gorilla with facial paralysis. The guy's got serious acting chops. He just never uses it because it's easier and probably more fun to just make shitty comedy movies. And let's be real, if I could tap an entire studio's resources to bankroll a vacation for me and my friends under the pretense of filmmaking, I'd do it in a heartbeat too. Even with all that taken into consideration, though, I do still prefer it when the Sandman actually tries. Hustle is a good example of that. He's great in the movie. He makes the entire movie better with his performance. Something I really appreciate is when movies don't hold your hands in regard to technical jargon. Even if you don't understand exactly what anyone is saying, a well-made script will still guide unfamiliar viewers through the narrative without stopping to stare at the camera and explain what a mitochondria is or how a power plant works or whatever. Everyone in Hustle speaks basketball, and I sure as hell do not speak basketball, but I was still able to follow along very well. That's quality scripting right there. Even more impressive, though, is the fact that this movie actually got me to care about sports for 2 hours. I was invested in basketball for a brief moment in time. Nothing about this movie reinvents the wheel. It's a standard story with standard characters who have standard arcs and grow in predictable and standard ways. But just because something isn't revolutionary and groundbreaking doesn't mean that it's bad. I still order hamburger at restaurants I've never been to because hamburger is tasty and it's hard to fuck up. Same goes for feel-good success stories like this one. Sure, the humor isn't always there, and it's not going anywhere I didn't see coming, but Hustle was an enjoyable way to spend an afternoon.
Number 39, it's Triangle of Sadness, baby.
Triangle of Sadness is, by and large, a scathing satire of the extravagant culture of the ultra-rich, told in 3 acts. Each act examines a different facet of modern capitalism. The first touching on gendered expectations regarding spending habits, the second looking at the cognitive disconnect between the working class and the wealthy elite, and the final act going into the actual labor value produced by those two classes. Ironically, the separation of ideas between acts is my biggest problem with the movie. It never feels like it actually finalizes a point, never concludes its ideas with either a cohesive statement or even an open-ended question for the audience. It almost feels like it just gets bored with one idea most of the way through interrogating it and discards it completely for a different, related, but ultimately separate idea. The middle act is by far my favorite, partly because it's the one that leans furthest into absurdism and has a climactic, cathartic punchline, but also partly because it feels like it has the most to say, comes closest to giving a conclusion to its thesis statement, and is the best at weaponizing satire. If more of this movie had gone as hard as the dinner scene went, it might have been one of my favorites of the year. That said, this movie is goddamn heavy-handed. It's like playing slapjack with Hellboy. Even if none of the acts really have a specific point that they arrive at in regards to the socioeconomic ideas they discuss, they all have an extremely strong and blatant general point that none of the world's ultra-wealthy create meaningful value. It trends towards tedious and unnuanced a lot of the time, and often feels like it's simply acknowledging social failures and saying, wow, isn't that silly and dystopian? We truly do live in a society. On the whole, though, I guess I'd rather an anti-capitalist movie be too aggressive and obvious rather than too passive and subtle, if for no reason other than to minimize the number of annoying centrists who think they resonate with it on Twitter. I went into this expecting a highbrow, artsy movie with lots of dialogue-driven snarky humor and posh accents. There was some of that, but the moments that really hit were the lowbrow, overflowing floods of puke and shit moments. Stumbles at the end pretty hard, I think. Honestly, the third act is just a mess all around. But God, there truly is some gold here. Also, if you're prone to motion sickness, maybe take some Dramamine before watching this. Genuinely maybe the most effective portrayal of seasickness ever put to the big screen.
Number 40, it's Beavis and Butthead to the universe, baby.
Going into this movie, I wasn't totally sure I'd be able to get through it. Beavis and Butthead's style of humor is fine in small doses, but hardlining it for 87 minutes sounds like a good way to simulate the neurological effects of huffing spray paint. So you can imagine my surprise when this movie managed to be very watchable, and even pretty damn funny. By bringing the two into the modern day, it opens up tons of new subcultures to make fun of, and the sheer idiocy of the main characters means they don't have to worry about any premise being too stupid. The basic premise is that Beavis and Butthead are sentenced to space camp as punishment for destroying their school science fair, and end up actually going to space for real, where they get sucked into a wormhole that conveniently spits them out in the modern day. In the present, they are given a quest by intelligent, parallel versions of themselves to return to their old timeline to save the universe. They promptly ignore this in favor of trying to find the hot lady astronaut from space camp to hook up with. As they meander brainlessly across America, they learn valuable lessons about white privilege, credit card chip readers, and prison riots. The movie is at its best when it's lampshading parts of modern day culture. The detour at the university is probably my favorite part of the movie because it leverages the exact year that it came out. The prison scene, in contrast, feels like it could have happened back in the original series. The modern era opens up plenty of new jokes, so it feels like wasted potential when it makes jokes that don't depend on taking place in the 20s. I mean, shit. This movie is already so dated to a specific time that you might as well lean into that as hard as possible. Give me a subplot where Butthead learns you can buy porn with cryptocurrency. I don't fucking know.
Number 41, it's Glass Onion, baby.
Not as good as the first one, but I probably could have told you that before I watched it too. I really enjoy these movies, and I hope Daniel Craig and Ryan Johnson keep making them until one of them or both of them die, possibly on the same day like Adams and Jefferson. I'm always going to enjoy this funny accented detective causing problems for the lowest intellectual denominator of rich criminals, so this movie would have had to really suck for me to not at least have a decent time with it. Some of the COVID humor was lame, but really all topical humor makes me roll my eyes when I'm so close to it. It does the sequel thing, where everything is bigger than the last movie. The location is more bombastic, the scope of the story is bigger, the runtime is longer. It's all just more, and it feels like it's just for the sake of being more. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just an immutable truth of the nature of movies like this. It's not a deal breaker for me, at least. It's still contained to a small area, and it still has a small cast trapped in that space, which is good enough for me. I did not care for the mid movie plot twist. I've seen a lot of discussion about how in mysteries, the audience is never supposed to have less information than the detective. And while I don't think that's necessarily always true, it didn't add anything for me in this particular case. Otherwise, pretty fun time at the movies.
Number 42, it's Barbarian, baby.
When I saw this movie, I was in the process of moving into a house that I didn't really know the history of. Imagine seeing this movie about a fucked up secret room in the basement of an unfamiliar home, and then having to sleep in a brand new home for the first time that same week. It should be fairly apparent, then, why this might be the scariest movie of the year for me. Your mileage will vary, of course, but I watched it at the exact right time to scare the shit out of me. It's a bizarre film, in a way that I found really refreshing. There's a scene that I really liked in the first part where the main girl steps outside in the morning and it's revealed that the rest of the neighborhood is completely dilapidated while this single Airbnb is perfectly maintained. It made my hair stand on end. It keeps constantly building tension throughout the first act, culminating into a really effective jump scare before hard pivoting into a totally different kind of movie for the second act. I was thoroughly jarred by the Justin Long stuff, and more than anything, I was just impressed they had the balls to do something like that. Really good what the fuck moment. The third act didn't impress me nearly as much as the first two. The horrifying titty lady became a lot less scary once I got a good look at her, and nothing really lived up to that jump scare at the end of the first act right before the pivot. The showdown at the very end on top of the water tower was hilarious for the wrong reasons, and I was hoping that when the homeless guy said there were worse things in those tunnels, he meant they just kept going deeper indefinitely with more twisted things in the lower levels. It really got my imagination going. But no, he just meant the cabbage-eating pervert in the back. Even still, this movie was creative and it held my interest the whole way through. I'm excited to see what this director does next.
Number 43, it's Devotion, baby.
Is it just part of Glenn Powell's contract that he has to be an aerospace guy in any movie he's in? It feels like the only things I've ever seen him in, he's played a pilot. The obvious comparison to draw between this movie is to Top Gun, and though they're superficially similar films with Glenn Powell playing a Navy aviator, they're really quite different. Rather than an uncomplicated blockbuster, Devotion is an intricate character study. It's a good thing that the relationship between the two leads is so compelling, and honestly more grounded than this movie probably deserves, because the actual story is kind of plodding. It's not particularly dynamic, with a lot of slow, methodical scenes and very little action. The real focus is on day to day life as a Navy aviator in the Korean War. I think that's okay, because it gives plenty of room for the relationship at the forefront of the film to shine. And it truly does shine. I probably could have tolerated an extraneous 20 minutes of runtime if it was just the two of them chatting. I cannot give the rest of the film nearly as much credit, though. The script itself is pretty threadbare, the action sequences are sparse and generally short, and other than the two leads, all the side characters kind of feel like they're just wandering around aimlessly. It's just an average war drama about friendship. And even if that friendship is really well done, it doesn't change the fact that nothing else about it is especially fresh or interesting. If the story of this movie was better, I think it could have truly soared as a character film. This Jonathan Majors guy has some real screen presence. I hope he continues his upwards trajectory and doesn't fuck up his career somehow.
Number 44, it's the Lost City, baby.
I'm not generally much of a romantic comedy person, but I am a globe-trotting adventure person, and the trailer for this movie intrigued me just enough to get my ass in a theater seat. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much I really enjoyed it. Obviously, it's not a particularly demanding watch, it's mostly just a pastiche of romancing the stone type rom dramas from the other pulpy romance schlock from yesteryear, but we don't get many adventure stories these days, and The Lost City goes down easy. Daniel Radcliffe kills it in this movie. He's clearly having so much fun, and it's thoroughly in line with a lot of other goofy roles he's taken in recent years. He's filling a bizarre but important niche in Hollywood, I think. Channing Tatum and Sandra Bullock are sufficiently charming and have good chemistry. I think making Tatum play someone so unfathomably dumb was a great creative decision. He really sells it. The guy is uniquely gifted at playing dumb beef slabs. Something I do hate is when a movie spends the first half of itself poking fun at the tropes of its genre, and then spend the second half embracing them and performing them without irony. The Lost City isn't the only movie I saw this year that did this, but it still sucks to see it happen. The first half is full of great jokes, good characters, it's paced excellently, so when it switches over, you can feel all the momentum evaporate. I don't know if it's because this movie ran out of stuff to do halfway through, or because it just didn't think it had the ambition and focus to make it all the way through without defaulting to easy emotional beats and simple jokes. Maybe it should have just been 90 minutes. That might have solved that.
Number 45, it's Turning Red, baby.
A pretty cute movie about growing up. Really dialed in on a specific style and setting, which worked well in its favor. Obviously, I can't relate to all the specifics of the story as someone who grew up white and male and with parents who held reasonable boundaries, but it's not like I can't empathize with the themes present. Kids are cringy and stupid, and that's really something that should be celebrated. We were all dumb and hormonal once, and I think it's important to look at kids doing whatever TikTok dance is popular these days or awkwardly asking their crush to the dance, and recognize that you were equally lame at one point in your life. You don't have to be a product of generational trauma to resonate with that. I don't think the movie totally sticks the landing. I think some of the storytelling is a bit scattershot and feels rushed at times, but I'm not holding that too much against it. It's clearly a personal project to the people who worked on it, and that shines through every layer of the film. It may not be a flawless movie, but it retains the heartfelt storytelling that Pixar has been well known for. Now, this movie did have the misfortune of getting in the iron sights of the Helen Lovejoys of the world, who were aghast at the idea of menstruation being mentioned in a kids' movie, and it was pervasive enough in the discussion that surrounded this film around its release that I feel the need to bring it up. Personally, I think it's good for that sort of thing to be touched on in mainstream media. It's a natural bodily process, and it shouldn't be stigmatized. It really sucks that the only opinion a lot of people heard about this movie in the lead up and follow up was that it was about periods, because I think that does a disservice to it. It's better than the discourse would have you believe, and it deserved more than the drama that surrounded it.
Number 46, it's See How They Run, baby.
Saoirse Ronan really carried this one for me. Such a fun character that I wish was in a better movie. Not to say I had a bad time with this one, I thought it was pretty fun, but it just wasn't very unique in how it presented its mystery, and the meta elements got on my nerves after about 2 minutes. I just feel like if a movie is going to look directly at the screen and say, if you've seen one whodunit, you've seen them all, the least it can do is present it in an interesting way. It tries, with the layers of theater and various adaptations of the same story within the real life movie, and the whole final act drawing them together with an amusing character cameo, but it still comes off as entirely too safe and secure. It limps to the finish line. It's got redeeming qualities, though. There's plenty of great performances and a lot of fun, dry humor. It's hard to be too mad at a movie if it manages to be consistently funny. I would have liked some tighter direction, I think. Would have been nice to give the characters a bit more physicality in the world, but it was mostly pretty nice to look at. Overall, fairly fun movie. The average parent will probably like it, so watch it with yours or something. I'm so glad that whodunits are in fashion this year, even the less good ones are still fun.
Number 47, it's Beast, baby.
We need more movies like Beast. I feel like it's been a while since I've seen a lean, man versus nature survival thriller with hardly any frills or sluggish pacing. If you know barely anything about this movie, you probably know everything it has to offer. Idris Elba fights a lion to protect his kids. That's the movie. The lion feels sufficiently dangerous, and hardly a moment goes by where you feel like the characters are truly safe from an ambush. The South African savannah is beautifully shot, and the environments feel real, tangible, and carefully chosen. And the tight 90-minute runtime allows it to build tension and action quickly without overstaying its welcome. Those damn kids have to have been on the lion's side, though. It feels like every moment they're either trying to get themselves or Idris Elba killed. They call him on the walkie-talkie when he's trying to stay silent, they wander off when he tells them to stay in the car. I get that people do dumb things in survival situations, but at some point they're just actively offering themselves to the cat. Also, 4 dream sequences is far too many for a genre movie like this. I don't care about this guy's dead wife, I care about this guy not getting killed and eaten by a wild animal. He should too. In the end, though, I like creature features, and this was a solidly executed one with decent pacing and action that made me excited. My standards for this kind of thing are pretty low, and it manages to meet them. That's all I can ask out of a movie like this. Also, really funny that the movie spends the entire runtime building up to the epic Idris Elba versus Lion showdown. And as soon as it does happen, he gets his shit completely rocked within like 5 seconds. That lion just heavyweight champions all over him as soon as the bell rings. It rules.
Number 48, it's Day Shift, baby.
Some movies feel like they were made for the very specific environment that is the drive-in. Not a real movie theater, and especially not offloaded onto a streaming platform to half watch on your couch, but meant to be seen with 4 close friends while lying on a picnic blanket in the trunk of a half-clean SUV at the tail end of summer. Day Shift is one of those movies, and it makes the brave new world of non-stop streaming releases and the slow death of local movie venues feel all the more bleak. This movie engages with its premise in a way that lends itself very well comedically. It's got contortionist vampires, action scenes with ragdoll physics, a vampire hunting union that's more interested in red tape than actual vampire hunting, and of course, Snoop Dogg with a Tommy gun. Plus, a hilariously goofy villain, some fun chemistry between the 2 leads, and Boyka as a vampire hunter. I'm willing to overlook a lot of flaws for an experience as fun as this movie provides. Now, when this movie isn't showcasing vampire slaying action or letting Dave Franco and Jamie Foxx riff off each other, this movie does drag a bit. I'm of the opinion that films like this should really try and be as vague as possible about the inner workings of their world, because it can totally fall apart when closely scrutinized. Which makes it feel pretty sucky when I have to listen to several minutes of exposition about the specific types of vampire and what makes each one unique. Like, I'm willing to engage with the movie on its own terms. I don't need it to try and meet me halfway. Overall, though, if you're like me and love schlocky vampire movies, this one makes for a fun afternoon. Just sucks that I can't watch it projected on a big tarp from the comfort of my car.
Number 49, it's The House, baby.
I'm not usually one for anthology films. I would generally rather watch a single, longer movie than 3 brief shorts, and I think that the quality of the weakest part of an anthology is likely to drag down the whole production. I watched The House not because the basic premise was interesting, but because I love stop motion, and I was pleasantly surprised. Each of the 3 parts have their own distinct identity, but a cohesive style and interesting through line of what if there was a house that had freaky stuff going on. Having done some home renovation myself recently, I resonated with the idea of not really knowing what the deal with a living space is. Each of the 3 stories plays with that idea in some way, and the end result is unified, despite each part being mostly disconnected from each other. I think the first part was my favorite. I liked the horror elements, and it reminded me a lot of Coraline. Check this one out if you want a cool stop-motion anthology about a fucked up house. I thought it was good, but I truly don't have a lot to say about it.
Number 50, it's Vesper, baby.
Vesper is a slow burn drama set in an apocalyptic wasteland. The bourgeoisie in the citadel floating above the world distribute seeds that are genetically encoded to only produce so much yield to the workers on the surface. The story focuses on a young girl and her father struggling to survive in this harsh environment while trying to find a way to unlock the potential yield of the seeds. This movie's aesthetics rule so hard. The set and production design makes this whole world look eerie and strange, especially with the biopunk technology. The organic looking structures, the mist hanging over the landscape, and the way it's shot give the whole movie a dreamlike quality. I really love how visually fascinating this movie is, especially considering the low budget. It's definitely the high point of the film, and it's quite easy to get immersed. However, other than the aesthetics, I just didn't think it did much interesting or different from tons of other sci fi stories. The story beats are predictable, and the class struggle presented here isn't much different from tons of other stories like Elysium or Prospect. It's a great setting, don't get me wrong, but it just feels like the story is too threadbare, with too little of its own to say. Also, the phrase, "My name is Jonas," occurs verbatim in this movie, a fun Easter egg for the more invested fans.
Number 51, it's the Sea Beast, baby.
I can appreciate an attempt to make a serious, emotionally driven movie for children. Sincerity and charm are always going to stand the test of time better than fart jokes and pop culture references, and given animation studios' addiction to focus testing the shit out of anything that might come in contact with a child, it's nice to watch something that clearly doesn't talk down to its young demographic. Obviously, there's nothing in this movie that How to Train Your Dragon didn't do earlier and better, but hamburgers aren't less tasty because steak exists. The Sea Beast is still a fine movie about examining the status quo. What this movie really gets right is the swashbuckling adventure vibes, especially at the beginning. The way they portray life on a monster hunting ship, as well as the battle against the sea monster at the beginning of the movie, makes it seem like an exciting and dashing lifestyle, full of energy and charm. The animation is vibrant and exciting, and all the action is visually interesting. These vibes pulled me into the movie at the start, and they were enough to keep me interested the whole way through. I thought the character designs were pretty bland and lackluster, though. All the main characters and the monsters feel almost underdesigned, with very few features that make them stand out from the rabble. The story was also pretty bare bones and uninteresting, really just plotting from point A to point B in order to hit the necessary story beats without much interesting happening in between. All in all, this isn't a bad movie. I'm actually pretty positive on it, especially the aesthetics. I wouldn't be ashamed to show this to a child, but I wouldn't ever really seek this out to rewatch on my own time either. That shouldn't be much of a surprise, though. It's not like I'm in the core demographic for this film, anyhow.
Number 52, it's the Menu, baby.
I'm glad that making fun of rich people has become so mainstream. Out of any demographic you could possibly make fun of, the wealthy elite is pretty much the only one that it's outright impossible to be punching down on when you make them the butt of your jokes. The Menu feels almost good natured in its ribbing, though, almost like a Comedy Central roast. I understand that it's difficult to criticize the greatest benefactors of capitalism when you exist and are funded by the same system, but you need to actually pretend to be transgressive and activist if you want me to be fully on board with the premise. At least it subverted my expectations by actually not being about cannibalism. Since the Menu isn't anything resembling a critique of capitalism, though, it has to pretty much stand on its own as a comedy thriller, and in that sense, it's pretty compelling. I liked it. It's got some great individual moments, like the whole Tyler's bullshit thing, but it's not actually that great at building tension in the long term. Some dynamic scenes are well done, others are boring. Some of the humor landed, but not all of it did, and I feel like it would have generally been more enjoyable as a more serious thriller. Still, though, I had a pretty good time watching it in the theater, but I felt like it was missing the claws that would make it really interesting. Also, the aspect ratio in my theater was wrong, so I couldn't read the full descriptions of the menu items. Bit of a bummer, but it doesn't actually change anything about my opinion.
Number 53, it's Bros, baby.
The very first joke in this movie got a pretty good laugh out of me. The main character hosts a podcast called The 11th Brick at Stonewall, because as a cis white gay man, that's probably the brick he would have thrown. Nothing else quite lives up to that first moment, unfortunately, but it makes a valiant effort that results in a cute, funny, mostly inoffensive, and kinda forgettable romantic comedy. I'm glad it exists, at least. Studio comedies feel like a dying breed, and seeing one whose existence is so rooted in queerness is, at minimum, nice. There's a couple things that drag this down for me, though. First and foremost is the fact that despite trying to distance itself from standard straight people rom-coms, it feels very paint by numbers. The basic story beats are all exactly what you'd expect from it, and the haphazard editing makes those beats either blow past without feeling meaningful or overstay their welcome and become tiresome. Second, I didn't really like any of the side characters. They felt like stereotypes more than fleshed out people. I get that they make jokes about that within the movie, but still. If you're so inclined, you could make a pretty uncharitable reading into the fact that so many genderqueer and non white characters were underdeveloped or one note to make room for the cis white romance at the center. I'm not going to make that reading because at the end of the day, any amount of non hetero storytelling is rare, but you could make it. All that said, though, this movie is clearly a labor of love. The people involved put a lot of themselves in it, and they created something that I'm ultimately happy was able to be released. I found value in it, even if I didn't love it. And hey, the most important thing for a comedy to get right is the humor, and I really did find it quite funny. That alone made me regard it as a fairly worthwhile viewing.
Number 54, it's Violent Night, baby.
You know those people who can't shut up about how Die Hard is a Christmas movie? The ones who push the jokes so far that it stops being funny and starts to become sort of tiresome. Like they've decided that it's a real hill to die on, or that they're somehow persecuted for their belief that John McClane is a Christmas icon of the same category as Rudolph or the Grinch. This movie was made specifically for those people. It's about a violent, alcoholic Santa Claus who's lost his faith in Christmas, deciding to take it out on a bunch of armed mercenaries holding a wealthy family hostage. If that sounds like a good time, you'll probably think it is. And if that sounds like a mid-tier Family Guy cutaway that mutated into a feature-length film, you'll probably feel that way at the end too. You really get out of this movie what you put into it. What I appreciated most about this movie was how violent it is. Obviously, it's in the title, but I feel like if you're going to have a concept like this, you need to lean into it and not be afraid to show a lot of gore. This movie is more than happy to show people getting their heads caved in with hammers or pulled into wood chippers or whatever the hell. It's not sanitized, and that really does work in its favor. It's kind of the only thing working in its favor because all the characters and the overarching relationship drama that drives the plot is really, really boring. This really should have just been a vehicle for violent Christmas-themed puns and visual gags, but it spends so much time pretending to have an actual emotional through line that I just cannot take it seriously. If nothing else, it's a departure from typical Hallmark pablum, which makes it better than about 75% of Christmas releases on premise alone.
Number 55, it's Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, baby.
The last thing I was expecting in this charming little movie about an old woman getting a fancy dress was a detour to discuss workers' rights and collective bargaining. But here we are. Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is a straightforward little story about a woman who deserves nice things and eventually does get them, but not before showing every single person involved in the fancy clothes industry that there's something they could learn from the working class. There's a lot of heart in that premise, but it's not really a lot for me to hang my hat on. It feels like a Hallmark movie that's trying desperately to pretend that it isn't one, and sometimes it even succeeds at that. Not to say it's all bad, or that it's even bad to begin with. The costume design is excellent throughout the movie, selling both the period and the wealth class of the characters really well, which I think is important for a movie that focuses so much on fashion. Maybe the most important thing, honestly. The lead performance is another highlight. I don't think this movie would have been half as good if Leslie Manville wasn't so damn charming. And while the ending wraps things up so neatly and predictably, it's a genuinely happy ending that feels pretty earned. I think out of every movie on this list, this one might be the most suited to a rainy day indoors. It's simple, charming, feel good, even if it's predictable and cloying at times. Check it out if you've had a bad day and just want to watch something simple and fuzzy.
Number 56, it's the Yellow Wallpaper, baby.
I watched this with a friend who was doing some classwork on the short story. I really liked the short story, and I thought this was an admirable attempt at an adaptation. But the thing is, given that it's an adapting a story that takes up all of 10 pages, you can really feel how much of a struggle it was to stretch it to feature length. This movie is remarkably slow and often repetitive, rather threadbare in its execution, though not so much that it's completely unwatchable. Some pretty odd editing choices on top of that, which only exacerbates the sluggish pacing. I really do think it could have stood to just be a short film. There isn't enough content to adapt into a 100-minute runtime. Not to completely disparage the film, I thought it did a pretty decent job at capturing and adapting the vibes of the source material. Pretty solid atmosphere through the whole thing, and a sense of dread that was distinctly separate from the sensation of reading the short story. Some interesting audio visuals in particular. The actual tearing of the wallpaper is conveyed in a way that a written story simply couldn't. I think it's actually a case where having read the story first lets me appreciate the film adaptation more, though it's not without some significant flaws. I would consider it more of an interesting and worthwhile attempt rather than a truly successful film.
Number 57, it's the Black Phone, baby.
I never actually read the story that this is adapting, but I do think it's pretty funny that Stephen King's son deliberately doesn't use his last name to distance himself from his father and succeed on the merit of his own writing. And then he writes stuff that's pretty much indistinguishable from the typical Stephen King tropes and ideas. There's children with psychic powers, abusive parents, psychotic bullies. It's set in either Colorado or Maine, and there's a bunch of dead children that propel the plot forward from beyond the grave. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, there's a reason that King is the king of horror novels. It's just amusing, is all. The Black Phone is about a child kidnapper named The Grabber, and his most recent victim, Finney, who receives phone calls from the ghosts of previous victims through a disconnected landline. Each ghost gives a little bit of information about the grabber's modus operandi, as well as a tip on something they left behind that Finney might be able to use to escape. It's a suitably mean-spirited premise, but my problem with it is that it's rather formulaic. After about 2 phone calls, it's blatantly obvious that it's gonna keep going down the line until it gets to Finney's buddy who was grabber just before him, and that's going to be the last piece to the puzzle, both to the grabber's character and Finney's escape plan. Every single thing I expect to happen does, in exactly the way I expected it to. In some ways, it's satisfying to see all the pieces fit together smoothly at the end, but in another way, it's so unchallenging to watch that you pretty much have the whole scope of the movie sorted out by minute 50. The other thing I don't really like about this film is the dialogue. It's so unbelievably expository that I almost think some, like, producer's notes managed to creep into the actual script. The film dedicates several minutes to characters just explaining shit. I think it's easy to blame children for being bad actors, but I'm actually going to put this one squarely on how they were written and directed. The child actors were actually overall quite good, and I hope they continue acting. It just sucks that they were held back by the surrounding circumstances of the film. Neither of these things are total deal breakers for me, though. This movie does have some legitimately good things going for it. The atmosphere and tension is overall pretty solid, and Ethan Hawke has a dramatic and unhinged presence throughout the entire thing. Relatively fun horror thriller, overall. Also, using On the Run as a needle drop is a baffling creative choice that actually somehow worked well. I have no choice but to respect it.
Number 58, it's the Pale Blue Eye, baby.
I'll give this movie a lot of credit. The acting is exceptional. Harry Melling and Christian Bale both absolutely kill it in their respective roles, and I thoroughly enjoyed seeing their characters interact and try to solve this mystery together. Especially in the first half, it's compelling to be immersed in this bitterly cold setting and try to figure out what's going on. The second half takes that interesting mystery and well-crafted atmosphere and takes it nowhere interesting. It just becomes a chain of red herrings to keep the mystery up as long as possible, and it culminates into an unsatisfying reveal. It's a real shame that these well-crafted pieces don't fit together perfectly, because the vibes are truly exceptional throughout the first half. It's not even that it totally falls apart, it's just that it doesn't ever live up to the potential offered by its technical excellence. I still had a pretty decent time with it, mostly because I just like murder mysteries, and I'm happy to spend some time watching even a kinda bad whodunit. But this year had a metric ton of them, and this is a pretty weak in comparison to some of the mysteries I liked more. I don't know though, there are a lot of nearby timelines where I didn't even finish this one. I'm a busy guy, I could have watched anything that afternoon. It's weird that out of every movie I saw this year, the most sunk cost I feel is towards this one, a movie I have an overall benign opinion towards.
Number 59, it's Marcel the Shell with shoes on, baby.
Pretty cute. Maybe a little too low stakes, even for my high tolerance for navel gazing, but overall a sweet and charming little story with some good life advice. Some nice bittersweet moments for sure, but also a decent amount of stuff that was clearly meant to be moving that just didn't land for me, so overall a fairly hit or miss emotional experience. It's clearly a passion project that was really important to the people working on it though, and there's a level of sincerity in that which I found charming and elevated the film for me. Marcel is a character I think will resonate with a lot of people, and his aphorisms and optimistic platitudes are nice to hear. It's just that such a sweet, simple movie doesn't actually leave me with much to say other than, Yeah, that was pretty cute. A lot of people in my theater cried. I will say the animation was quite good. I really liked the blend of real time footage and stop motion. It worked very well and came out seamless. I never watched the YouTube shorts, but I imagine that they've got a similar vibe, and if that's true, I can totally see why they wanted to bring this character to a larger theatrical audience. Sorry, I don't really have much to say about this one. Check it out if you like cute, small scale stuff.
Number 60, it's the greatest beer run ever, baby.
Weird movie. Apparently, it was based on a true story. It's a movie about a fool who travels to Vietnam in the middle of the war to bring his buddies some beer. Fun premise, I suppose, but I don't really like how the movie framed it. The characters sort of go through the motions of chastising him, but the narrative itself seems to almost enjoy portraying his exploits as courageous, when in reality they're reckless and wasteful. He barely even learns anything until two-thirds of the way through the movie. The first half has a comedic tone, which I don't think it pulls off very well, and the second half has a dramatic tone that I don't think it earns. It matches up cleanly to the fact that the actual beer run is mostly over by the first half, leading into a B plot about the illegal dealings of the US military during the war. It leads to a confused tone that Zac Efron's performance can't really set straight, even with his charm and stupid mustache. Also, for such a weird premise and presentation, this movie seems oddly convinced that it has a serious emotional core that will resonate with audiences, when it just doesn't. It thinks I'm gonna, cry when that one guy got killed after two scenes of getting to know him, but in reality, I'm just gonna say, oh, bummer for him, and move on with my life. At least Russell Crowe is good in this.
Number 61, it's Uncharted, baby.
I know the canon opinion on the internet is that this movie sucks 12 kilotons of ass, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a pretty good time with it. I don't know, maybe I contracted COVID and lost my sense of taste, but hey, I'm a sucker for a globe-trotting adventure, and I don't have any attachment to the video games this movie is adapting. Maybe because I never played Uncharted and therefore don't have an opinion like, just play the game instead, or just watch a cutscene compilation on YouTube. I'm willing to give this movie a bit more slack. Not to say it's perfect, of course, or even especially great. I'm just saying that I found it much more watchable than a lot of people on the internet say it is. Don't get it twisted, though. There's a lot to hate, like having to look at Marky Mark's face for an extended period of time, or the downright atrocious humor. This guy's old! Everyone point and laugh at how old he is. He's an old guy who uses Tinder, and he has so many apps open on his phone because old people don't know how to use technology. Truly miserable. I also really didn't buy Tom Holland as this dangerous, competent thief. He's just thoroughly unbelievable as a dashing rogue sort. Harrison Ford was young and hot in A New Hope, but he also had a dangerous edge that made Han Solo believable. Tom Holland just doesn't have the face or the demeanor for that. One day I would love to see some insane visionary cast him as a deranged we need to talk about Kevin type sicko, and it'll probably be the best performance of his career. But this did not suit him. Overall, I thought it was pretty meandering, oftentimes kind of stupid, and full of annoying characters, balanced out by pretty locations and some fairly fun action scenes. Let's just call this my second least favorite Indiana Jones movie and move on.
Number 62, it's Paws of Fury, the Legend of Hank, baby.
People say you couldn't make Blazing Saddles in the current political climate, and this movie is proof that you actually can, as long as it's disguised as a kids' movie. What I most appreciate about this movie is that it has a really fast-paced script with rapid-fire jokes. It's not something I see often in kids' animated movies these days. Oftentimes in movies like, I don't know, The Minions, if a joke doesn't land, I have to watch it for another couple moments before the bit finally ends. In Paws of Fury, jokes come and go so rapidly that if one doesn't land, you don't have to wait more than a few seconds for the next. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of jokes in this movie didn't land. There's a lot of toilet humor that I'm really not here for, some crappy one-liners, but there's also some great visual gags. There's a scene where they fire a musket right as a bird flies in front of it and it explodes. That's top-tier comedy. But there's also a lot of really good background gags that are super easy to miss. Humor aside, though, this movie has some weird tonal shifts throughout. Sometimes it's trying to be a straight samurai movie, other times a samurai parody, and at the end there's like a whole army of characters from various genres who just show up and don't do much relevant other than reference something else. Character growth doesn't seem to stick either. We have like 3 different scenes of Samuel L. Jackson's cat character trying to quit drinking. There's like 2 scenes of Michael Cera's dog character realizing how to be a proper samurai. It's very strange. I'd recommend it above a lot of children's animated movies simply based on the quick humor, but I don't know if I would actually call it a great movie. If anything, it's just a thought experiment to see what would happen if you really did make Blazing Saddles today.
Number 63, it's Elvis, baby.
I'm a sucker for good visuals. If you give me a good spectacle, some insane nonsense will bolster any movie to an at least watchable level. Elvis is one of those movies that's batshit in a way that I really appreciate. Visual nonsense dominates practically every scene. It rules that it's told from the perspective of a cartoon villain, and it's awesome that they put a kaleidoscope in front of the camera for shooting every scene. I think for a figure like Elvis, the style works. This is a movie uninterested in an accurate portrayal of history, and more interested in displaying the legend around a mythological figure in American history. I've never been a fan of Elvis historically, but while watching this movie, I got it. I understood what made him a phenomenon, even if I knew that a lot of stuff didn't happen the way the movie presented it. But that's the power of movies, baby. Elvis is a symbol of America, and Boz quadruples down on him as that symbol over and over, and it works every time. Nobody sane could have made this. This is the worst movie that ever should have gotten a Best Picture nomination.
64, it's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, baby.
Every issue I have with this movie can be distilled into a few seconds towards the end. Doctor Strange, possessing his own reanimated corpse, harnesses the spirits of the damned into a badass cloak, and right as he prepares to take flight, a single, searing power chord resonates. It's everything I wanted from this movie. But then he actually takes flight, and that electric guitar fades into the generic, triumphant orchestral soundtrack that seemingly every Marvel movie bears like a cattle brand. That's what I hate about this movie. Every time it tries to deviate from the base template by more than like 10%, it gets violently jerked back. The end result is almost indistinguishable from every other blockbuster superhero movie that's put a stranglehold on cinema in the last 15 years, but with a few glimpses of something truly mold-breaking beneath the surface. In a just world, we would have gotten a gory, face-melting horror comedy with tons of rubbery practical effects that really leveraged the multiverse to make for some insane scenery and set pieces. You can tell that's the kind of movie Sam Raimi wanted to make, and his style is recognizable in a lot of areas, like the scene transitions and the crazy zoom-ins. It is, at least, the most interesting MCU movie in the last several years, because of this tug-of-war between a director who wants the movie to fuck like hell and executives who want the movie to conform to their style guide. But ultimately, it's just a disappointment, because what we could have gotten is so much cooler than what we actually did. If it only had to shoulder the disappointment of making poor use of Sam Raimi, Multiverse of Madness still had the potential to be one of the very best MCU movies. But it also suffers from making poor use of its own premise. There's hardly any universe hopping in this, and the main one we spend time in is barely different from the main one. A lot of the violence is pretty restrained too, which is expected for a PG-13 superhero movie, I suppose. There's some really fun set pieces here and there, but I saw people talking about how off-puttingly weird and scary this movie was when it came out, and I have to wonder if they watch anything other than Marvel films. There's a great movie in here somewhere, but it could never have been made under the Disney Panopticon. It's still my favorite MCU of the year, but one day I'm just gonna check out and never see one of these again, and my life will measurably improve.
65, it's good luck to you, Leo Grande, baby.
The second best romantic movie of the year that spends most of the runtime in a hotel room. This movie is primarily composed of dialogue between the two leads, a prudish older woman who's never experienced good sex in her life, and the sex worker she hires to try and have a good experience for the first time. Over the course of the film, they discuss matters of physical intimacy, how shame affects how we view ourselves, and the idea that everyone deserves pleasure and enjoyment if they want it. It's a nice sentiment, and I'm certainly receptive to it, though it does often feel like it's delivering basic body-positive platitudes without any meaningful support. For as much as it talks about pleasure for the sake of it, and the idea that sexual satisfaction isn't something that needs to be earned or even needs to be a big deal at all, it feels like it spends a fair amount of time justifying that to itself, like it doesn't actually believe it. It did lose me pretty hard in the later part of the movie, After the really funny first half, but before the genuinely excellent final scene, was a bunch of melodrama that I really didn't care about and really didn't feel supported the messaging of the film. That final shot, though, really does feel earned. Absolutely the perfect way to cap off a film about embracing sex and one's own body. I wish it had gone further with that, but given the single location nature of the film, it's easy to see why they didn't. Also, Emma Thompson is a goddamn phenomenal actor, and I feel like I always forget that until I see her in something and go, oh yeah, she's great.
66, it's Raymond and Ray, baby.
I didn't especially dislike this movie, but it also really didn't do much for me. I like the basic premise quite a bit, at least. Two half brothers reunite for their estranged father's funeral, only to discover that his dying wish was for his sons to dig his grave by hand. As they excavate his plot, they process who they've become and how he affected them. The thing is, I just didn't think this movie did much interesting with that concept. I generally like introspective, character driven films like this, but this one felt so flat and emotionless that I couldn't get into the characters or care about their problems. It doesn't help that I found most of the secondary cast very unlikable. The way the two brothers engage with the auxiliary cast isn't nearly as interesting as how they engage with each other, and so much time is spent on these secondary interactions. Every moment feels exceedingly scripted, too. Most characters seem like they were glancing over each other's shoulders to read the teleprompter. It made every scene feel stiff and unnatural. Like when someone you know goes for a hug, but you're not sure you're really there with them, but don't want to hurt their feelings, so you kind of let it happen. That sort of awkwardness permeates every performance of the film. There are a few standout moments, like when one of the brothers takes a gun and shoots the shit out of his dad's corpse, which makes the drabness of the majority of the film sting so much more. If it had 9 or 10 great moments instead of 2 or 3, I'd probably have really enjoyed it and been able to look past its faults. Instead, I thought it was just okay.
67, it's Spiderhead, baby.
As fun as it was to see Chris Hemsworth in a scheming, villainous role, this movie didn't resonate with me especially strongly. There's plenty of interesting nuance to this story, and I hear the short story it's based off of is quite good, but it just seems uninterested in engaging with the details of its premise in satisfying ways. The commentary on the modern prison complex is bare bones at best and actively flexes away from any meaningful statements at worst, and it's made worse by obvious and predictable twists that detract from any potential mystery solving element there might have otherwise been. Capped off by a final act that might be one of the year's weakest, and you've got a movie that amounts to a below average, extra long Black Mirror episode. If that's your thing, you'll still probably enjoy this, but my standards for psychological thrillers and high concept science fiction are slightly higher. Not a lot higher, mind you. I did find stuff to enjoy in this movie. Chris Hemsworth is fun and charismatically convincing in his farm bro villain role, and I liked some of the visuals. The set design was consistently pretty good too. The prison that the story takes place in feels like it has a real, comprehensible layout. But this one feels like it's going to resonate strongly with Rick and Morty fans the most. It's got that sense of breaking down high concept science fiction into easily comprehensible bites, and then telling its audience that they're so smart for understanding such complex subject matter. Maybe that's unfair to Spiderhead, or to Rick and Morty, but I think this movie just isn't as compelling or as smart as it thinks it is. Which is a shame, because I think the premise could have enabled both some fascinating psychological horror as well as striking social commentary on the prison system in America. Untapped potential, strained through a sieve, and broadcast to the front page of the lowest denominator streaming service on the planet. Just unfortunate stuff all around.
68, it's Metal Lords, baby.
Every person on the planet goes through a phase in their teens where they decide that their music taste is somehow objectively superior to everyone else's. For most people, it manifests as a quiet sense of superiority over everyone else on the bus while they listen to their dad's favorite band through their headphones. But every once in a while, you meet a guy who's devoted their entire goddamn juvenile existence to the idea that they're a musical messiah, sent to Earth to elucidate the beauty of whatever the most popular 3 bands in their favorite genre is. This movie cuts pretty close to the bone in that narrow, specific sense, evoking the sense of either having been that person or knowing someone who was that person. It's pretty impressive how well they managed to capture it. In every other sense, though, I thought this movie was mid as hell. I've seen plenty of these musical coming of age narrative about bringing the band together kind of stories, and I've also seen plenty of these misfits strung along a threadbare plotline and encountering hijinks stories. And after a certain point, I just think the best space in high school comedies might already have been mined. I don't expect anything to be as good as Superbad, I just expect a little more than this. I had some amount of fun with it as a fan of metal, I guess, but I really couldn't get enough of a grip on this film to feel like it had anything of substance. It's just a battle of the band's high school story with a slightly edgier aesthetic and some cameos from famous musicians. I'm sure it would have been perfectly suited to like a 2008 release climate, but in current year, it really just feels heavy and dull.
69, it's DC League of Super Pets, baby.
Not the worst animated movie about talking dogs I've ever seen. I really, truly didn't believe that a movie for 5-year-olds about Superman's dog would be watchable to me, but I didn't hate this film. I didn't love it, but it's not a movie I wanted to shoot myself during. There were even a few jokes I really liked. In particular, Batman trying not to lose his shit over an unlicensed Batman chew toy. The assortment of super animals was surprisingly not too intolerable, and even though they were pretty one note, they did a good job at not overusing them. I was pretty tired of that damn pig by the end, though. Even the villains were pretty fun. The final act with, like, the hamster uprising made me roll my eyes, but that's kids' movies for you. We got two movies with a hamster apocalypse in the third act. How weird is that? It's really remarkable that DC's live action movies are so consistently garbage, while even the mid tier animated stuff aimed at junior citizens tends to be decently watchable. It's practically a law of physics. It was obviously aimed at a younger audience that I don't belong to, so I missed out on a lot of the appeal, but I'd watch this 20 times before I touched the live action Justice League again.
Number 70, it's Death on the Nile, baby.
I don't think this movie needs to exist, but I guess I'm positive on the idea of getting a Poirot movie every year. They're passably watchable and endlessly disposable, and there's 8 million of them to adapt. He's clearly having fun, and I'd rather have more murder mysteries made than fewer, regardless of how good they actually are. The biggest problem with this one is that it's fucking boring. It should be a felony to go this long in a murder mystery without any murder actually happening. I could feel my brain trying to go into sleep mode because I was just waiting for literally anything interesting to happen. When it does happen and Gal Gadot gets murdered, the movie becomes significantly more entertaining, which isn't surprising but is worth noting, I suppose. Sad to be deprived of her baffling line deliveries, though. Everything looks unbelievably artificial in this film, too. Jesus Christ. It's rare to see the ground that characters are walking on look this fake, not to mention the pyramids. Holy shit. It doesn't help that everything is lit with this bright ass lighting that makes everything look like a sitcom. I don't mind when things don't look real in movies, don't get me wrong. I just wish we could return to like hand painted backgrounds instead of terrible computer graphics. Or just shoot on location. That'd be cool too. The mustache origin story was pretty funny, I guess. I liked how tasteless it was. I hope in the next one we learn that he got his tie in a prison riot or something.
Number 71, it's the worst person in the world, baby.
I wanted to like this movie. I really did. Everything about it seems like the kind of film that I would really enjoy. But when I actually sat down to watch it, I just couldn't get into it. I tried two separate times, and I found myself bored or just disinterested in this woman, her problems, and the selfish life she lives. It's not like it's fundamentally disinteresting either. These themes of feeling adrift and directionless in the world, pushing off of and away from other people in an effort to reach the surface, are interesting. The passage of time puts pressure on all of us to figure out who we are exactly before it's too late. This movie really understands that feeling. But I don't know. Maybe if I feel especially lost and alone at age 30, I should give this another try. The worst person in the world is told in 12 small sections, each detailing parts of her life, her insecurities, and the conclusions she makes, right or wrong, on how to navigate life. Some of these parts are excellent, others are tedious. It's the problem with anthologies, that the worst segments can drag down the entire product, except that in this case, all of them are linked into a single story, and that makes it harder for the good ones to shoulder the bad. The cheating chapter and the time stop chapter were legitimately excellent, but the remaining 10 left me feeling cold. I understand why everyone else seems to like this one, but I really just missed the boat here. I didn't even hate it, and given how well acted and shot it is, I don't think I possibly could. I just don't understand the outpouring of love that I've seen it receive either. It's a real shame, but it means that this is one I'm likely to revisit when I think I'll get more out of it.
Number 72, it's the unbearable weight of massive talent, baby.
There were about 5 different movies bundled into this one movie, and the best one was the one where Nick Cage and Pedro Pascal hang out and talk about film, which is a problem because that's the first one, which means that everything after that just goes downhill. It doesn't help that I'm not a huge Nick Cage guy either. I mean, I like a lot of his films. He's a good actor who's made a lot of good movies. But those people who incorporate being a fan of Nick Cage into their fundamental personality are deeply strange to me. Because of that, I think this movie didn't really connect with me on any level deeper than a gas station pothole, because this movie feels so targeted towards those people who build their self-worth on consuming every piece of media that features the guy. I had a few laughs, I recognized a few references, and I got to roll my eyes at all the meta commentary. What more could I ask for? Seriously though, someone needs to answer for the popularization of meta humor. I know it wasn't Rick and Morty's fault, but I'm willing to scapegoat that show if it means we never have to suffer through movies like this that stare directly at the audience and go, "Remember Mandy? That was a good movie, right? Remember Nick Cage was the dad in The Croods? How silly!" If this movie can't think of a better joke at any given moment, its default state is to go, "Look how self-aware I am!" It's interminable. Actively makes the film worse by at least 25%. This really is just a commercial for an actor who's been in literally dozens of movies better than this one. It's like watching a car commercial, except the whole commercial is them showing you nicer, cooler cars instead of the one the ad is actually for. I don't really want to finish The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent if it's just going to spend the whole time reminding me that I could be watching Raising Arizona instead. I know this whole review might come off as kind of hateful, but I actually didn't hate watching this movie. I left the theater thinking of it positively even, though I'll admit it's slid down in my estimations of pretty good distance ever since. I know you know a Nick Cage superfan somewhere in your life though, and if they haven't already seen this 8 times, you should recommend it to them.
Number 73, it's Aqua Teen Forever Plantasm, baby.
Out of all the adult animated shows that could have had a surprise movie in 2022, Aqua Teen is not one I expected even a little bit. And it was pretty meh. I really like the characters of Aqua Teen. They're all horrible in their own entertaining ways, but I think the humor of the show works much better when they're doing absurdist nonsense like fighting turkey robots than doing hard-hitting social commentary on the evils of capitalism. The idea of an Aqua Teen movie with a coherent structure, character arcs, and stakes feels so out of sync with the ethos of the show, I'm not sure I can get behind it. The animation got an upgrade at least. Seeing these characters move smoothly in 3 dimensions was neat, though jarring. I definitely prefer the late night trash vibes of the old animation, but it's a strict improvement from a technical standpoint, I suppose. The humor is generally what you'd expect from the series, though I didn't like the Moon Knight stuff very much. They've always been some of my least favorite recurring characters, and them interjecting into a movie that's already only 75 minutes long to derail it got kind of frustrating. Otherwise, it was pretty funny though, especially the whole used Baby White Mountain thing. Overall, it was a little too topical, a little too polished, and a little too much Moon Knight madness. If you're really into the show, you've probably already seen it, and if you're not into the show, I probably couldn't convince you to watch this at gunpoint. This one doesn't have Neil Peart, so it's automatically worse than the first one anyways.
Number 74, it's Smile, baby.
Another one of those movies I feel I should have liked a lot more than I actually did. It's got plenty of great elements. The tension is built really well, it looks nice, there's some good psychological elements, but it's not afraid of being gory and violent. There's even some good scares. So why didn't I like it that much? I'm honestly not sure, and I'm probably going to rewatch this at some point to see what I missed the first time around. Maybe I just thought the concept of the monster was kinda dumb. I usually prefer more literal monsters to metaphorical representations of the characters' fears. Even if this movie does take a literalist stance towards its premise at the end, with a truly well-designed trauma monster, it spends a lot of time pretending to be something more alliterative. I'm not opposed to horror as an allegory of grief or stress or whatever. I think it's even a primary purpose of the genre. It just didn't work for me here, I think. But even that feels like an unfair justification to dislike this movie, so I think I'm really just gonna have to accept that there are some things in the world that don't resonate with me for reasons I can't articulate well. I did like how the movie ended, though. The inclusion of an actual monster instead of just an It Follows possession type thing was a welcome surprise, and I always like when horror movies end on a bleak note. Good direction and color, too. The film is very cohesive and well shot throughout, and it does a good job at evoking mood through its lighting and camera work. Even though I didn't have an overall great time with the film, I'd actually recommend other people go and check it out. A lot of people seem to have gotten something out of it, and I do think there's a lot to like. It just didn't work for me.
Number 75, it's Strange World, baby.
It's fun to look at. I really enjoyed the visuals of this weird and complex world. They absolutely knocked that aspect of the film out of the park. Top to bottom stunning, really the sort of thing I hope for with every animated Disney release. In some sense, the story almost feels like it exists just to serve those visuals, like every event that happens is constructed to uncover a new weird and interesting vista. If this were a documentary, I'd be thrilled about that. But it's not. This movie does, unfortunately, have an actual story to tell. It's a flat narrative, pretty uninteresting, with hardly any driving stakes. Certainly not enough to make the wheels spin on what is, visually at least, supposed to be a fun sci fi romp. It's surprising that this story is so limp because Disney movies tend to have quite strong and focused narratives. But the boring story and the boring characters mean that it's difficult to find any kind of foothold to make the beautiful visuals more than passively interesting. People rag on Disney slash Pixar for finding one kind of antagonist and overusing the shit out of them for a decade. Last time it was the twist villain, and now they've pivoted towards no villain at all, instead letting generational or informational gaps between the main characters be the driving force of emotional drama. According to a specific genre of annoying guy, it's the central narrative problem that plagues every Disney film of the last decade. Personally, I don't usually care about the loss of cackling malevolence like Jafar or Ursula. I certainly don't think it's bad storytelling to not have a villain. But in this specific case, I feel like it does the movie a disservice. It's clearly, at least visually, inspired by pulp adventure stories, and all the ones I've read, at least, have a clear, intelligent antagonist, usually a silly, over the top one by modern standards. Real shame for this specific one to eschew that in favor of a multi generational trauma narrative. Who knows, though? Maybe one day this will find its footing as a cult classic, along with all of Disney's other adventure bombs like Treasure Planet.
Number 76, it's Cara, baby.
You know those cinematic rides at theme parks where you sit in a cart surrounded by screens and it bounces you around to simulate you actually being in the action? Think like Star Tours. This movie is basically a 2.5 hour one of those, except you don't get the cart. It gave me a severe headache, so much so that I'm actually not sure why I even bothered to finish it. Most physically painful movie of the year. The whole movie is shot like it's a single long take, which I guess makes it a technical feat of some kind, but it doesn't add much value to the experience. It's obviously fake, it's distractingly blatant in its falsehood at certain points. The constant action and the theoretically seamless transitions between every moment make the whole thing blur together into a single mind numbing stream of action. It's indulgent, sure, and I'm usually totally here for the level of excessive violence and stylistic nonsense this movie has, but that's predicated on me not getting motion sickness during your film. And also, maybe having a script that one could follow, because this movie manages to be constantly expositing information through like 3 characters at once, and also still be completely incomprehensible the majority of the time. Nobody's actions make sense, none of the plot points make sense, and there's straight up no emotion to any of it. At least some of the action is okay. It escalates smoothly over the course of the runtime, and there was a massive amount of violence due to the structure of the film, so you don't really get a breather between fights. In that sense, I guess it's a successful action movie. It's just that it could have been a silent film, and also an hour shorter, and also shot like a normal movie, and I probably actually would have liked it a lot more than I did. As it stands, this is a Call of Duty campaign cutscene that became self-aware and clawed its way onto a streaming platform.
Number 77, it's The Whale, baby.
I've been rooting for Brendan Fraser to come back into the limelight for a long time. He doesn't deserve all the stuff that's happened to him, and I'm glad that he's back in acting. I just wish he'd come back in a better movie. The Whale has exactly one point that it circles and underlines and highlights over and over for the entire runtime, and it's really mean-spirited about it in a way that feels excessive. I know it's an Aronofsky film and all, but still. It feels like The Whale can't go 30 seconds without someone ripping into him for being fat, or gay, or a bad father, or fat, or being too nice, or fat. For as harsh and cruel as it is, the movie feels formulaic and easy despite it. It doesn't take any risks, it doesn't do anything unique. The score is over the top and is obviously meant to reinforce the emotions of the film, but it's so obvious about it that I can't take it seriously. The characters are written so hilariously that I can't take them seriously either, especially Sadie Sink's character. It's comical how cruel she is. There are good moments. The relationship between the whale and Hong Chau's character is really great. I can't imagine what it's like seeing someone you care about make decision after decision that you know will eventually kill them. The scenes between the two of them are easily the highlights of the film. The final 5 minutes or so were also pretty good, though the actual last shot is so breathtakingly stupid that it kind of balances out. When I finished watching the movie, the first thing I thought to myself was, what was the point of all that? It's so afraid to examine this character beyond any superficial level that the negativity that surrounds him just feels vile. It feels voyeuristic to watch such a miserable existence unfold in such a sterile, unsympathetic manner.
Number 78, it's Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, baby.
John Mulaney and Andy Samberg are already kind of filed as the same person in my brain, so you can imagine how confusing this movie might have been for me. These kinds of IP crossover movies always kind of wear on me. Fundamentally, they're always going to be commercials first and actual movies second, or maybe third. Just because there's actual jokes and story and even talent that went into this movie doesn't mean that it's not a vehicle for shoving recognizable properties down your gullet. Even to the point that they put fucking ugly Sonic in there. Remember? From the original trailer for the Sonic movie? Yeah, he comes up more than once. I know that's a pretty cynical way to look at this, but you might be surprised to know that it actually exceeded my expectations by a fair amount. I expected Space Jam: A New Legacy all over again, where everything gets sidelined to make room for as many references and hashtag memeable scenes that a boardroom full of Hollywood's finest sex pests can dream of. Instead, I merely got a much worse version of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is kind of like being merely a much worse hockey player than Wayne Gretzky. It doesn't balance branding and satire very well in comparison, though it does have one edge over its predecessor, and that's the clever use of various animation styles and mediums. The notion of a 2D character getting CGI plastic surgery is pretty clever, and I like the claymation cop who actually has clay physics and can like walk through fences and shit. I wonder if the cocaine he plants on poor people during traffic stops is also made of clay. I hate to give this charcuterie board of references to better media too much credit, though. And even if I had an okay time siphoning 90 minutes of my life into Walt Disney's lich body, it's hard for me to actually feel a strong positive emotion towards something so corporate. That's what this is at the end of the day. A corporation pointing at a bunch of intellectual properties and saying, see that? We own that.
Number 79, it's Duel, baby.
In the movie Nightcrawler, the main character Lou talks in a way that's clearly pulled from various self-help books and sales advice articles. It works in that movie, because he's obviously unfamiliar with how normal people communicate, and everyone else finds him off-putting and untrustworthy for it. In Duel, every single character talks like that. It got on my fucking nerves after about 15 minutes. The idea of a clone and an original having to fight to the death has a lot of thematic potential. You could explore what it means to be a unique individual, or whether a duplicate person deserves the same rights as an original. But this movie is so disinterested in exploring these ideas that it's practically bending over backwards to avoid them, even as they become relevant to the narrative. It leaves bizarre holes in the fabric of the film because it refuses to engage with its premise beyond the very basics. Like, yeah, it's a movie about a double that everyone likes better than the original, but it does nothing that isn't done by Enemy, Swan Song, The Scapegoat. These are just off the top of my head. I don't know. If you really, really like doppelganger stories and cannot get enough of them, no matter how many there are, check this one out. But I thought it was mostly boring, uninspired, and with some of the most insufferable characters I've ever had to experience.
Number 80, it's Fall, baby.
Fans of 47 meters down will enjoy 609.6 meters up, especially the identical plot twist. I'm going to start by praising the cinematography because it is the best part of the movie by far. The camera work is really solid and definitely sold me on the initial premise. The sweeping drone shots do a great job at showing the scale of the structure they're climbing, and a lot of shots are legitimately vertiginous. Combined with the close shots of rusting bolts and swaying cables, it makes the first 20 minutes or so feel tense and dangerous. Unfortunately, good atmosphere and camera work isn't enough to offset some serious issues with the script. The amount of disbelief this movie asks me to suspend is more than I'm willing to give it. Like, they decide to try dropping a phone all the way to the ground and hope it sends a message during the fall, but They brought a drone with them. They could just tie the phone to the drone and fly it to the ground. It's not like they're on a time limit. There's no monster coming to eat them. They're not running out of oxygen. They have all day to sit up there and brainstorm a better plan than drop the phone in a shoe. I'm also expected to believe that this pair of incredibly experienced climbers brought a single water bottle and 50 feet of rope to share between them, and that they just clipped the rope to each other's waists and not once clipped into the actual structure. They really deserve to get stuck up there. And dumb stuff like this is why the movie is over 2 fucking hours for a single location thriller. There's a seed of a good movie here, but it needed like a dozen more script revisions to get there, so we're just left with this: a bad chamber thriller and a bad survival movie.
Number 81, it's Black Panther Wakanda Forever, baby.
The steadfast refusal to recast T'Challa is honestly kind of baffling to me. They would really rather kill off one of their most iconic and interesting characters because the actor died in real life than they would put a different guy in the suit. Personally, I think it does more of a disservice to the character to kill him than it would have to have someone else play Black Panther. The fact that they made his death the focus and driving force of this plot is at least the best way they could do this, I suppose, but you can feel the gaping void in the center of this film. It feels unbelievably cynical to package a $200 million cog in the cinematic clockwork as some kind of loving tribute to an actor that had just died. All this to say, this movie had no main character, and because it had no main character, it had no central focus for its nonsense story, having to instead fall back on some kind of ensemble cast that it doesn't juggle well. None of these characters can carry their respective subplots because it's all anchored to a character who no longer exists. It can't settle on anything because nothing is load bearing. Maybe it could have been some kind of introspective story about having to take up a mantle of leadership while still grieving someone close to you. It's an idea the movie tries to pretend to touch on, but Marvel doesn't actually make movies like that. It alludes to the fact that it could make movies like that, and then lets people extrapolate and pretend that they actually do. People cried at Tony Stark's funeral, and it's because these movies are propaganda for themselves. Instead of all that, we have a movie about nothing. It's a movie about a bunch of white dudes having a red tape adventure in Washington. It's a movie about Namor, a fish guy from underwater Wakanda, and his clash with land Wakanda. It's a movie about beta testing not just a new Black Panther, but a new Iron Man. There's no focus, nothing intersects well. It's all bloodless stabbing and pointless dialogue. I promise that I go into these MCU movies intending to give them a fair chance, but I think the best years are just behind us.
Number 82, it's Men, baby.
Men might actually be one of the most visually arresting horror movies I've seen in years. The rich colors and the camera work really go a long way to immersing you in this little town in the English countryside, and it does a great job at building up the off nature of all the men who inhabit it. The vibrant greens of the woods, the inky black of the tunnel, the deep red glow of the rental home, it's all a treat to look at. The characters are fun too. I liked the menagerie of Rory Kinnears that are tormenting the lead, and he was clearly having a good time switching between all of them. The first half of the movie, with these two things serving as a base, makes for a deeply chilling and exciting experience. The tunnel scene in particular is genuinely fantastic. Then the second half of the movie starts, and it all goes really downhill. It's a shame, too, because they laid this immaculate foundation and then decided to build a rickety, shitty shed on top of all their perfectly laid concrete. Not to completely knock the second half of the movie, it's got some evocative imagery. I especially like the part where the horrible priest with the fucked up arm rests his split hand on both of her shoulders. It's just that I'm starting to get tired of horror movies where the whole thing is just an allegory for grief or trauma or whatever. Sometimes a monster can just be a monster, you know? I don't need to see a guy give birth to himself 4 times to get the movie. It's like it was manufactured for one of those crappy ending explained YouTube channels. And it's made even more weird by how it tries to do a literalist, oh my god, it really happened thing at the end, which is asinine considering how blatantly metaphorical it all was. It confuses the muddied messaging even more than it already was, to the point that I truly don't know what this movie was trying to say by the end. Something about men, I imagine. This movie had a lot of potential, and it's got a decent amount of truly great stuff, but I just cannot recommend it overall.
Number 83, it's Pearl, baby.
Pearl has an air of self seriousness that I just don't think fits the characters or the premise. Sure, Mia Goth is a talented actor, and she's convincingly insane in this movie, but like, do we have to make it into a whole thing? People on the internet really like to dick ride the ending monologue, especially, and sure, it's really well done. That level of acting ability is certainly impressive, and the scene has plenty of narrative weight, but it's in service of a movie that's ultimately not even that great a depiction of small town dreams being crushed by the real world. At least X has some gore to buttress those ideas, even if I didn't find any of those kills that interesting. I think Pearl is mostly a fine character study. The focus on this character and her insane need for greatness is made more tragic by the knowledge that she never actually makes it. It makes for a decently compelling story and character. She's violent, determined, and clearly unhinged, and the movie doesn't shy away from the consequences of that. As a companion piece to X, though, particularly one that released after that movie, it's dragged down by the anchor weight of being a prequel to a film I didn't really like. If I watch each movie on their own merits, pretending the other just doesn't exist, I liked Pearl a lot more as an individual story, but it's impossible to do that because of how directly tied the two films are. Credit where due, though, the movie was really pretty, and a lot of scenes were shot with some great attention to detail and color. But hell, if I wanted to watch a horror movie just to see pretty shades of red, I'd rewatch Suspiria.
Number 84, it's Minions, the Rise of Gru, baby.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but this movie is actually better than the 2015 Minions movie and better than Despicable Me 3. The bar is on the goddamn floor, I know, but I went into this movie fully expecting Illumination to tunnel under said bar like a cartoon robber escaping a jail cell. Instead, it managed to surpass my unbelievably low expectations and soar to the height of merely being not very good, which is a solid A tier by Illumination standards, so we're at least front foot forward on this one. The minions aren't really characters so much as they are vehicles for jokes, which is a valid way to approach comedy, but it means that your movie lives and dies on its humor. If the jokes aren't funny, your movie is worthless, and to my comedic sensibilities, the minions are usually not funny to an unbearable degree. They always feel less like they have any agency in the narrative and more like they're bumbling through it, stumbling from slapstick bit to slapstick bit. And if any of them aren't funny to you, guess what? They're like 4 minutes long a piece, so it takes forever to move on to a joke you might actually like. I don't give a shit about the minions struggling to fly a commercial airliner, but if that joke hadn't dragged on for an entire extended sequence, I might have simply not cared. But it lasted long enough to actually irritate me, which is the opposite of thinking something is funny. All this to say that the minions can't carry a story on their own, which is why the 2015 movie gargles my balls through a straw. They don't have to carry the Rise of Gru, though, because the plot is furthered largely by characters that are actually kind of fun, like young Gru, who I enjoyed despite my best efforts, and the slew of gimmick villains. The relationship between Gru and the adult villains he looks up to is honestly some of the best character work Illumination has ever done. It's just a shame that this movie couldn't have been a standalone Gru prequel without the little yellow overall tic tac motherfuckers.
Number 85, it's Deep Water, baby.
The premise of this movie was actually interesting. It's about two fundamentally shitty people trapping each other in a purgatorial marriage, as Ben Affleck systematically murders the various lovers of his adulterous wife. But Jesus Christ, this movie was so mind-numbingly dull. I felt like someone injected my brain with Novocaine. Every scene in this movie is myopic and sluggish, even the murder scenes. Some guy's getting violently drowned, and all I can think is, I don't care about these people or their problems. I think the biggest issue with this is that so much hinges on Ben Affleck's performance as this serial murderer with deep, complex internal emotions that rarely bubble over his calm demeanor. But it doesn't work because he has the expressiveness of sheetrock. You could hang a paper mache mask on an oak sapling with his voice dubbed over it and get an equally evocative performance. Anna de Armas isn't much better in this. She's pretty much just a pair of tits that happen to have the remainder of a human attached to them, and her only emotions are horny or angry. Sometimes both. The movie also tries to engage in some moral dilemmas around personal agency in murder, most notably in a scene where a few characters discuss whether making a computer chip that ends up getting used in drones that kill civilians makes you complicit in those deaths. But the movie spends barely a 16th of an ass fleshing out this quandary, so it just goes completely to waste. My favorite part of the movie was definitely the ending sequence. It's clearly been through editing hell because nothing in the last 20 minutes makes any sense whatsoever. Why did he put the wallet in the snail tank? Why is this guy texting while driving? Just call your wife, dumbass. This chase scene at the end made me laugh because, like, he's on a bike. What's he gonna do? Grab your bumper like Marty McFly? You could go 25 miles an hour and be fine. You don't need to cannonball run your way down this sketchy ass dirt road, especially not while texting. Done well, I think this movie could have been really great. But I think erotic thrillers really need a strong guiding hand who isn't afraid to get super weird with it. And this movie just felt like it lacked that strong sense of direction. Which is a shame, because I think the premise is interesting. On the plus side, this movie is a strong enough sleep agent that it broke my crippling NyQuil addiction.
Number 86, it's Easter Sunday, baby.
I think it's good to watch movies that you know you won't culturally connect with. It's good for the soul to consume things with the intent of gaining a different perspective, and to see other communities represented in mainstream media. I had to repeat that to myself a lot to force myself to finish this film. I'm sure Filipinos need more representation in Hollywood. I'm also sure they don't need it to look like this. Easter Sunday is a tired, boring movie about a guy who solves all of his problems, from passive aggression at church to being held hostage at gunpoint, by telling stand up jokes. Imagine being a stand up comedian in real life and making a movie where you play a character who saves the day with stand up. That's like me writing a story where the main character defuses a nuke by sucking his own dick with no hands. Beyond that, though, Easter Sunday just isn't a well put together movie. The situational comedy and the one liners both fall flat. The plot meanders all over the place and doesn't go anywhere concrete or interesting. The characters range from tolerably annoying to eminently groin kickable. And honestly, I'm just not the biggest family comedy person, so this was always going to be an uphill climb for me to like this one. It could have at least had the decency to asphyxiate halfway up the slope rather than content itself making snow angels at base camp. This movie is less funny than the third quartile of Everybody Loves Raymond episodes and has just barely more substance to its themes and plot. Also, what the hell is up with releasing an Easter-themed movie in August?
Number 87, it's Monster High, the movie, baby.
I don't know a goddamn thing about Monster High. I don't even really know why I watched this. It's not this movie's fault I thought it sucked. I knew that going in. I'm not a musical person. I'm not a Monster High person. So I'm not surprised my opinion of it is pretty low. But even if I tried to measure it as if I was into it, I don't think it's very good, you know? The acting is pretty not great. The songs are super hit or miss, mostly miss. And god, everything looked like it was assembled and lit inside a Halloween store. You can never expect too much from live-action Nickelodeon movies, but honestly, there's a reason I never cared for much of them even as a kid. They just look cheap. Very cheap. There's an argument to be made that kids' movies don't need to have complicated plot lines or especially talented acting. In fact, I'm in favor of them prioritizing having actors closer to the age of their target audience than ones with raw acting talent. But they at least deserve to watch things with competent prop and makeup departments, and maybe some halfway decent set design. According to one of my friends who actually is into Monster High, they butchered a bunch of characterizations too. I don't give a shit personally, but I'm happy to strike more points off. Also, kind of fucked up to establish a character's pronouns as they, them, and then refer to them exclusively by name for the entire rest of the movie.
Number 88, it's Moonfall, baby.
Moonfall is one of those movies that the Howard the Duck enjoyers of the world will try to convince you is so bad it's good, or possibly a fun watch with friends and drinks. There are a lot of movies like that out there that are entertaining simply because of how broken they are. Moonfall is not one of them. Moonfall is a movie intended to make losers with blacklight posters feel like they contribute something to society, or at least that they have the potential to. It's a movie that's too competent to actually be so bad it's good, making it just downright bad. It's actually astonishing that the director of Independence Day would come back 25 years later with a decently similar concept and have it come out this terrible and bland. I know he's capable of making good sci-fi blockbusters, he's done it multiple times before, so why does Moonfall exist in this state? The moon falling out of the sky is a simple concept, far too simple for the people who worked on this script to wrap their heads around, so they complicated it, with twist after reveal after explanation that culminates into a bloated mess of characters and story threads that rings exceedingly hollow. Nothing in this movie is original, it's all pilfered from better sci fi, and when it tries to twist and remix those ideas into its own thing, it's even more disastrous than the rest of it. Creatively bankrupt, aesthetically bland, and backed up by the most phoned in performances I've seen in a while. This movie is a nothing burger with nothing lettuce and a side of wistful memory for the days Roland Emmerich made good movies.
Number 89, it's the Gray Man, baby.
At least when Michael Bay makes a crappy espionage thriller, he fills it with explosions and gives his actors interesting stuff to do. When the Russo brothers are handed fistfuls of cash and a bevy of talented actors, they make them sloppily fistfight in smoke-filled hallways, in between long periods of aimless phone calls and the craziest facial expressions of Chris Evans' career. Everything about the Marvel action formula that the Russos pioneered is prominently present in The Gray Man, from the quippy bullshit that every character spews to the shaky quick-cut action. I think it's probably pretty hard to transmute airport literature into something this genuinely poor quality, but they managed it somehow. The craziest thing about this movie is how lost everyone looks. All the actors in this are genuinely great, but they just feel like they weren't even directed here. Compare any of these actors' other movies in the last 10 years to this one. They look like they were told to just do what feels natural and then hung out to dry. The hand-to-hand combat fares slightly better, at least that's actually choreographed and presumably involved multiple takes, but it's still just not interesting. Is this the state of multi-million-dollar action movies nowadays? A bunch of talented actors sleepwalking through nonsense shootouts? I get that movies are hard to make. It's shitty and reductive to look at a piece of art and say, I could probably do that. It's reactionary, and it diminishes the effort of the people who worked on it. That said, I truly believe that if I had $200 million, I could make this movie. I could probably make it better than this movie, actually. I'd start by having Ryan Gosling and Chris Evans make out in the third act.
Number 90, it's Don't Worry, Darling, baby.
Don't Worry, Darling is a pretty solid concept with a massive amount of talent attached that manages to squander all of it at every turn. It's not even flamboyant about it. Everything just kinda lists off to the side like a deflating balloon at the Macy's parade. The non-pop singer related performances are excellent, and the camera work is great, but it's all in service of a movie that simply does not come together. It just feels so poorly conceptualized, like nothing was finalized in the script before they started filming. There's no subtlety or nuance to anything. Like, yeah, I get it. American masculinity comes at the cost of feminine agency. I don't need a Harry Styles monologue about it. I've been paying attention to the 50s stuff the whole time. It's one of those movies that thinks it's a lot smarter than it actually is, and that it's saying more than it actually does. It technically has more to chew on than the average mainstream matinee thriller, but it also sort of falls apart under scrutiny, so there's a fun catch-22 for you. For all its symbolism and ideas about toxic masculinity, any criticism it has towards modern misogyny is either extremely obvious or extremely toothless. It's like a railroad worker with no depth perception, sometimes hitting the point and sometimes missing it entirely, but using a sledgehammer the entire goddamn time. It takes way too long for the other shoe to drop too. I think the reveal should have happened much earlier than it did. It started to feel like the movie was just withholding for the sake of it, seeing how long it could string the audience along. It made the final act feel cramped, like it didn't have enough time to flesh out its final ideas. Speaking of the ending, though, I couldn't stop fucking laughing when those three cars all collided with each other and exploded. What a stupid-ass scene. Not to say it's devoid of value. Like I said, the performances were generally great. Florence Pugh especially really sells it. I don't think this movie would have been nearly as watchable if her performance wasn't so believable. Chris Pine also looked like he was having a blast. I really liked his smug asshole performance. The visuals were great too. There's a solid attention to color and framing throughout the entire thing that elevated a lot of scenes. It just felt so empty and heavy-handed. I can't really recommend it.
Number 91, it's Firestarter, baby.
Out of all the Stephen King books about children with unexplainable powers, I think Firestarter is one of the weakest I've read. Which means that when it got adapted into a movie in the 80s, that movie sucked too. Which makes me wonder why the fuck they took another shot at it. I guess it was kind of inevitable given all the other King adaptations that have been coming out these days, but if there's anything I've learned about inevitability from the carbon monoxide leak in my house, it's that it's not synonymous with good. The biggest thing that stands out to me is that this movie just looks unbelievably cheap. Every set looks like it was assembled from cardboard 30 minutes before the camera started rolling, and every shot is either so close to the characters that I can count their pores, or so wide that I can see where the landlord painted over the light switch in the next room over. It makes everyone seem like they're standing in different rooms during dialogue scenes, and the rare action scenes just come off as incoherent and unfocused. Now, a movie isn't bad just because it looks like shit, especially when it comes to horror, but it has to have good characters and actors to make up for it. Firestarter doesn't do that. It actually seems to avoid it like the plague. Nobody in this movie is giving more than 10% of their maximum effort, and given the dialogue they've been given, I really don't blame them. If I had to say half the clunkers in this script with a straight face, they'd have to shoot me up with morphine to stop the twitching. The fire looked pretty realistic, I guess.
Number 92, it's Lightyear, baby.
Pixar is one of those studios that you can always expect to put out quality. They always feel like they have real effort put into them, and they're able to elicit strong emotions with how genuine they feel. Which makes it incredibly disappointing to say that this movie feels phoned in as fuck. It's just downright lazy. It's competently made, sure, but there's no substance to it, like a snow globe that only has snow in it. I liked the first 20 minutes, it had some legit ethos to it, struck the same nerve as the Up opening, which is an easy way to score points. But everything after that is a goddamn slog. Why couldn't this have been a Buzz Lightyear of Star Command movie? Remember that old cartoon? I used to watch the shit out of it when I was very, very young, and I would have liked this so much more if it was just a feature-length episode of that. All those good side characters they could have tapped into, but instead we get to enjoy Taika Waititi fail guy and Grandma who likes explosives. I like the cat robot quite a bit. Hell, I liked him more than Buzz, but he didn't offset my dislike of the rest of the characters. This movie should have been called Socks, honestly. Characters aside, the plot is bad too. I mentioned the first 20 minutes were good, but everything after that just meandered, and it culminated in a shitty, totally unearned plot twist that actually pissed me off a little. It's one of the lamest twist villains I've ever seen in any movie. Boring and unnecessary. This movie didn't need to get made, and the animation industry is worse for the fact that it did.
Number 93, it's Memory, baby.
This movie is so forgettable that when I went to write this review, I discovered that I had already written one. I guess that counts as an immersive experience. Memory is a pretty standard Liam Neeson action movie with a hook that slightly separates it from the other 512 movies he's put out since the turn of the decade. This time, the badass action guy has Alzheimer's. He's suffering with mental health while people are trying to kill him, which I guess adds a wrinkle to the formula. Fuck, though, I remember jack shit about this movie. It's like I got neuralizered on my way out of the theater. He kills some guys, he takes some pills, there's a couple halfway decent action moments. That's really all I've got. I know Liam Neeson isn't better than this, but Martin Campbell and Guy Pearce are, which is why I'm so surprised to see them here, and maybe even more surprised that they couldn't elevate it further than this. The best thing to come out of Memory for me is that after watching it, I did some research and found out that it's actually a remake of a Belgian thriller called The Memory of a Killer, and I decided to watch that to see how it compares. And that movie's actually pretty good. It's better paced, has better acting, better editing, and they didn't censor the shit out of anything remotely sexual. If you ever feel the urge to watch Memory, just watch the older, better version.
Number 94, it's Blacklight, baby.
If I had a nickel for every action movie this year starring Liam Neeson as an assassin with a mental condition, I'd have 2 nickels, which I would swallow before an MRI before watching this piece of trash ever again. I'm putting this one below Memory because the plot of this one was more convoluted and the characters were somehow more boring, but realistically, you could splice any scene from one movie into the other at any point in the runtime, and I wouldn't even notice, even if it cuts off a conversation mid-sentence. For being a thriller, this movie is fucking boring. None of the political intrigue was compelling, the plot was needlessly complicated, the characters were so one-dimensional that you could draw vectors from them, and the whole subplot about that journalist trying to uncover a conspiracy was incredibly pointless. Blacklight swaps back and forth between being a conspiracy-driven thriller and a secret agent action movie, and it sucks at being both. The most memorable part of it is the font on the poster. I'm not even kidding. I genuinely remember the fucking poster font more than any and every scene, line, or character. Blacklight is a movie that you get instead of the movie you wanted to download on a pirating website. It's a movie that's included in a 3-for-1 pack at the dollar store. It's a movie that plays as the in-flight entertainment on Spirit Airlines. Fuck this movie.
Number 95, it's Morbius, baby.
I'm ranking this very low, but this is maybe the only bad movie this year that I think fucking rocks because of how bad it is. Don't get me wrong, it's god awful. I don't want people to think I'm saying the movie is secretly good for the sake of contrarianism or whatever. But I get the impression that everyone except Jared Leto knew right from the start this was always going to suck. He treats his performance with a reverence that makes me wonder if he thought he'd be an Oscar contender for this. It's almost endearing. It's like submitting a macaroni elephant to the Guggenheim. Everyone else involved treated it with the exact amount of respect it deserved, which is zero. This thing looks and sounds like a video game. The vampires have color-coded smoke trails, they can air dash and glide and shit. Morbius straight up has a fucking Arkham City detective vision that he can activate at will. The CGI looks bad as hell, but it would have been right at home as a pre-rendered cutscene on the PS3. I spent every fight scene expecting to have to scramble for a QuickTime event. This movie has basically no frills. It is so stripped down that it's like piranhas got into the editing room. There's a ton of exposition that it just blazes through so fast that it doesn't even fully explain shit. Basically every subplot got ripped apart in post, and nothing side character related even gets followed up on. Characters talk like they're gonna get shot if they don't speak as fast as possible. There's no breathing room whatsoever. Jokes don't get to breathe, dramatic emotional moments don't get to breathe. It can't even linger on an establishing shot without getting antsy. Also, this is totally a gay romance. The two leads are boyfriends. I don't know how it's possible to read them otherwise. I hope we keep getting shit like this until the studio goes completely bankrupt. I've got a lot of room in my heart to love terrible vampire movies, and even if I can acknowledge the fact that this is a really fucking bad movie, I'm also not completely beholden to good taste. The specific ways in which this movie is broken as hell makes it the best worst viewing experience of the year.
Number 96, it's Samaritan, baby.
This one gets the award for the most telegraphed plot twist of the year. The best thing I can say about this gritty, grounded superhero movie is that it's not as bad as Hancock, which is kind of like saying that a fire ant sting hurts less than a bullet ant. While that may technically be true, I'm really not eager to experience either. I feel like the marketplace of dark superhero media has been pretty saturated, and in the wake of much better stories, Samaritan really feels like it's about 7 years too late. Everything about this movie is just flat and boring. The set design, the dialogue, the characters, the action, the world building, especially the world building. There is so much exposition and background information that went into Samaritan and his evil brother Nemesis that doesn't even remotely matter. So much of this movie is predicated on me giving a shit about these characters and their legacy, but I just don't. The main kid character sucks too. I found him deeply, deeply annoying. The lead villain is atrocious. All the side characters are lame as hell. Stallone himself is fine, but he can't carry a movie if he doesn't have anything interesting to do. And by God, he doesn't have anything interesting to do. CGI Sly is my sleep paralysis demon.
Number 97, it's The Invitation, baby.
If I were offered the opportunity to marry a hot vampire and live forever in a beautiful castle, I would take it. It hurts seeing other people live your dreams. I'm willing to look past a lot when it comes to trashy vampire movies, but this one was just too much even for my sensibilities. The dialogue is snooze-inducing, the characters are all either melodramatic or just really dumb, and nothing fucking happens for the entire runtime. It takes so goddamn long to actually get to the vampire stuff that I could have written and storyboarded my own better version of this movie while I waited. It takes so long to get there, in fact, that I wonder if it was supposed to be treated as a plot twist. But that doesn't make sense because it was such a big part of the marketing that this was a vampire movie. The final act of the movie is the most interesting part by a long shot, simply because things are actually happening. It's a hack disaster of filmmaking, but I'll always prefer that to a menial slog of nothingness, so I at least found some enjoyment in the bullshit that the last 35 minutes pulls. Like, Dracula himself appears, someone gets stabbed and it looks ultra fake, Shit gets set on fire. It's a really impressive display of incompetence, which is a massive improvement over the 16 hours of nothing I sat through to get there. This movie also does the thing I hate where it calls out cliches while still playing out those tropes. It's not a loophole in script writing, it just makes you look like an asshole. I can drive with my parking brake on, and me knowing and riffing about it doesn't mean I'm less of an inconvenience to other drivers. If you want to watch a bad vampire movie, there are dozens of more entertaining ones than this one. It's a genre so full of so bad it's good options, you never have to opt for one of the straight up bad ones. Don't watch this.
Number 98, it's Amsterdam, baby.
There are two kinds of bad movies. There's the kind that are so broken, so hilariously incompetent on every possible axis, that it becomes entertaining to see it fall apart second by second in a beautiful cascade of garbage. Then there's movies like Amsterdam, which are composed of a bunch of halfway decently made components that fit together poorly. You've got good actors, some steady camera work, and maybe even a half decent script, but none of it actually works together to make a functional film. It's the difference between blowing up a shitty Honda with tannerite and having to drive it to work every day for 6 years. Amsterdam is a lesson in excess. There is such a thing as too many plot threads, too many prominent characters, too many names on the poster. It is entirely possible to create something so big and unwieldy that it collapses under its own weight, which is exactly what happens here. Every plot thread involves like 7 different characters, each of whom weave in and out of the narrative constantly. It makes it impossible to remember who's involved in what. The chemistry between those characters is super off, too. I truly thought the 3 leads were in a polycule for about 2/3 of the movie. As vaguely annoying and unfocused as the characters are, it's even more tiresome to watch them shamble through the complicated mess of a plot. I can barely even summarize the story because so much is happening, and I can't keep straight which of it is crucial and which of it is meaningless. When it does finally tie everything in together, it does so in a 15-minute monologue right at the end that explains everything straight to the audience, because this movie wouldn't be complete without stabbing the concept of show don't tell in the parking lot. Any given individual moment in this movie is just kind of not great, but it all comes together into something truly unwatchable. Genuinely impressive in that sense, I suppose.
Number 99, it's X, baby.
Sometimes you hear about a movie that everyone is raving about, and then when you actually watch it, you go, wow, I didn't like that at all. Well, that's how I thought about X. I really feel like I'm missing something here because so many people whose opinions I respect said it was one of the best horror movies of the year, but I personally found it very disappointing. I don't think there was anything wrong with the premise, at least. The slasher genre is already a pretty sexualized one, and taking that sexuality to its logical extreme is something I can appreciate. The problem is that it just doesn't do anything interesting with that extremity. None of the characters are likable or interesting, and none of the kills are gruesome enough. The entire first half is mired in drama among characters that I couldn't connect to, and it utterly fails to interrogate the regressive, sex-charged violence of the genre in a meaningful way. I think it has some shock value, sure, but it's really only in the second half that it actually succeeds at doing anything interesting. It's not even a little bit scary, but there's at least some startling imagery. The 2 old people have a healthy sex life, and that's great for them, but I would really not prefer to see that. Mia Goth is also a genuinely good actor, and her performance is legitimately compelling. Those 2 things elevate this a bit above some other slashers, but it's still not enough to make me consider this film positively. This movie feels caught between the conventions of the slasher genre and the conventions of modern, elevated horror. I hate that phrase, but it's the best one I can come up with. X calls back to the colors and camera work of movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with beautiful hues and film grain and zooms and transitions that don't show up much in modern movie making. But it also feels caught up in the need to have plenty of drama and narrative weight that seems to plague a lot of horror these days. It's easy to scapegoat A24 for that, but it's not their fault everyone feels the need to apply insightful meaning to what could have been an unencumbered showcase of schlock violence. Unfortunate that it lands on the side of slashers with regards to pumping out a bunch of bullshit sequels. I would have expected that its artistic sensibilities meant it thought itself above such things. We'll see if Maxine can turn my opinion of Ty West's horror career around, but I'm not holding my breath.
Number 100, it's Black Adam, baby.
A little known fact about this movie that you might not have been aware of is that every single person involved was actually a computer-generated likeness of a real human. Even the camera crew. The truth is, the whole thing was created by an algorithm in a Warner Brothers black site to try and create a movie devoid of humanity. Trained on a steady diet of cape shit and Dwayne Johnson interviews, a computer program meticulously assembled Black Adam, a movie so substanceless that I fell asleep halfway through and still managed to watch the whole thing. It honestly sucks so hard that mainstream superhero movies have reached this point. Nothing is new about this movie. It's just recycling old tropes, jokes, and stylism from the last 15 years of the superhero cinema monolith. Everything looks cheap and bad. The characters are nothing more than vehicles for quips, with the exception of Black Adam, who's nothing more than a vehicle for brooding one-liners. The plot doesn't make fucking sense and is full of twists and payoffs for setups that weren't even there. Like, was Dwayne Johnson being the father instead of the son supposed to be a big twist? Because it sure didn't seem that way when the trailers told us he was the father outright. He's not remotely the most insufferable character in the movie, though. Most of the Justice Society are pretty obnoxious. I hated Tornado Girl and Giant Guy, and it irks me more than it should that the kid's supposed to be borrowing a suit from like the 80s, but it looks like every other modern day superhero costume. Get the kid a denim jacket or something. Pierce Brosnan as Dr. Fate was actually great, though. It seems like this was a one and done thing for him, which sucks because he's actually compelling and has screen presence that the rest of the cast can't match. The most egregious part of this movie for me is that they managed to pretty much wrap up the whole story and then realized, oh shit, right, this is a superhero film. We need a big battle at the end. And they just trotted out some fucking devil guy and his army of Jason and the Argonauts prop skeletons. It felt so blatantly like they were going down a checklist and marking off all the Cape movie standard tropes one by one until they hit a quota. Actually, I lied. The most egregious part of this movie was Skateboard Kid. I have never seen a more insufferable child character in a movie. I don't wish any ill will towards the actual actor, but I think any kid who thinks skateboarding around in a stairwell is going to be stealthier than tiptoeing deserves to be naturally selected by a mountain lion. Black Adam isn't just going through the motions, it's doing them worse and lazier than any of its predecessors. I hope that somebody with a house worth more than Eastern Africa got tarred and feathered for allowing something this embarrassing to be released in theaters.
Number 101, it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, baby.
There's one scene in this movie that really pisses me off. This dude walks into the other room and gets attacked by Leatherface. And as they struggle, the door swings open and shut while the camera sits motionless outside in the hallway. The swinging door really raises the tension as you only get brief glimpses of the fight. It's legitimately great. And then they cut to inside the room and you watch the rest of the fight in a shitty shaky cam. They had a legitimately good shot and they decided to make it suck. That's not my biggest problem with this movie, but it is a starting point. Everything about the movie falls into two categories, incompetent or tasteless. I'm not saying I need my horror movies to be tasteful, but I would like them to not be boring about it, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is nothing if not boring as fuck. Anything edgy about this movie just feels like it was decided in a boardroom of people who've never lifted anything heavier than their dicks, and that feels infinitely more cynical and distasteful than 100 school shooting subplots. As for the incompetence, I think that comes down to the fact that this movie is the inevitable convergence of two things. One, the Netflix model of firing a shotgun blast of terrible content at its users to see which terrible content attracts the most annoying internet users. And two, the general industry model of sequels, reboots, and remakes of things people recognize from last century in lieu of actually creating something of value. This was bound to happen. It just sucks to see it be so aggressive and obvious. Now, all of this could be forgiven if the kills were interesting. It's the one thing that a slasher movie has to do right. You could make the worst piece of shit movie imaginable and then piss on the undeveloped film, but if the violence is suitably gory and creative, it at least has some amount of reason to exist. This movie doesn't even have that, though. It's just flaccid in every way. I did think it was funny when a bunch of Instagram influencers tell Leatherface that they're gonna cancel him, and he responds by murdering all of them. If conventionally attractive people who make fortunes off of taking food photos and selling workout pills had to live with the fear of getting murdered by a big guy in a skin mask, all internet discourse would be solved overnight.
Number 102, it's Thor Love and Thunder, baby.
There's nothing sadder than a clown who keeps hurting himself in increasingly slapstick ways, trying to keep the attention of an audience that fundamentally does not care. It is painfully obvious when a piece of comedic work is so desperate for the audience to like it. It's like it reaches through the screen and begs on its hands and knees to you, specifically you, to grace it with a sincere laugh and justify its tortured existence. Thor Love and Thunder is that clown. A movie so terrified of being seen as unfunny that it fills every possible instant with jokes, regardless of the overall tone. It's actually impressive that a movie with so many tragic aspects can be devoid of actual emotional moments. At least ones that aren't undercut by Taika Waititi personally walking into the foreground like Rod Serling and holding up his phone to show you the screaming goat video. It's to such an asinine degree that they actually do a "he's right behind me" joke in fucking 2022. That joke is so old and tired that Futurama was lampooning it in 2000. Christian Bale is a deeply gifted actor who puts all of himself into every performance, so it is painful to see him squandered like this. He portrays a truly compelling harbinger of doom, a man hellbent on inflicting his own suffering on the gods he feels abandoned him. He's tragic, terrifying, and he could have been the shining highlight of the film, and even the MCU's villain catalog as a whole, if he'd been given more than like 6 minutes of screen time. Between him and Natalie Portman's character's cancer diagnosis, there's plenty of foundation to make a serious, dramatic movie about accepting death and loss. I get that Marvel's filmmaking ethos generally regards concepts like serious and dramatic in the same way a raccoon regards silverware: unnecessary at best, and a sturdy object to haphazardly strike things with at worst. But still, there's a reason the story of the God Butcher is beloved among comic book fans, enough so that even I, someone who really only reads comics on Free Comic Book Day, am keenly aware of the story and its reputation. They could have at least tried to pay respect to that legacy. I haven't even touched on the actual cinematic craftsmanship of this film, but this movie looks like butt and ass. Basically, every single scene feels like it was blocked in the laziest possible way on the greenest soundstage they had available. I really can't tell if the uninspired camera work is because it's easier to do reshoots if they only have 3 camera angles for the whole movie, or if it's because nobody gave a fuck about the end quality. The CGI is some of the muddiest the franchise has ever had. Everything just looks like blurry muck. I truly do feel for the digital artists who work on these projects. They work like 1,000 hours a week and miss their kids' soccer games for way too little money, and in the end it still looks like someone tried to recreate a Jackson Pollock painting with their balls as the brush. Thor Love and Thunder is a bad movie in most aspects, and the parts of it that are legitimately good are woefully underutilized to make room for more crap. I really try not to be one of those people who hates on the MCU just because doing so is the cool, socially acceptable, but still slightly edgy opinion to have, but I really feel like the standards should be higher for a franchise that dominates the cultural landscape to such a degree. We don't have to settle for this. Please don't settle for this.
Number 103, it's the Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild, baby.
I hate these goddamn possum twins with every fiber of my being, and making them the central characters of this movie made it one of the most agonizing animated films in history to me. I don't even know why it's called The Adventures of Buck Wild when it's so centered on Tweedledee and Tweedledumbass. Not like any of the other characters are much better, though. The ninja skunk and her fart cloud smoke bombs did not enthuse me. Buck Wild himself was way less funny than I remember him being when I was 8, and the stupid ass Brainosaurus villain guy got on my nerves after about a quarter second of screen time. It's hard to make a villain intimidating when he looks like he could be defeated by pushing him over and watching him struggle to pick up his gross, oversized cranium, like a baby who can't quite walk yet. The animation is also atrocious. The budget for this film must have been outright table scraps, because literally every single frame looks like the rendering computer crashed halfway through and they just went, let's just use the last save. In a way, I think this looks worse than the original Ice Age, because I understand that movie was pushing up against the technical limitations of the time period. It's charming in that sense. This has no charm. This makes me sad for the animators who had to work overtime and underpaid to make this ugly ass film. As far as the actual plot goes, it is so forgettable that when I went to refresh myself on the Wikipedia page to write this, my brain literally forgot the words as I read them. Which is really for the best, I think, because this movie was fucking trash, and the fact that my brain was able to so cleanly erase it is a privilege I don't get for very many bad films. This movie is not just an utter failure at being a watchable movie, it's also a disgusting example of Disney's overreach and monopolization of the industry by annihilating and consuming a smaller studio before puppeteering the lifeless corpse of their most recognized franchise. This is just fucking disrespectful.
Number 104, it's Jurassic World Dominion, baby.
This movie makes me legitimately angry if I think about it for too long. Despite being about dinosaurs in theory, it spends a whole hell of a lot of time trying to tell stories about anything other than dinosaurs. Its various subplots involve genetically engineered locusts, human clones, that one geneticist from the first movie getting a redemption arc for some reason, and all sorts of other shit that doesn't contribute to the core idea of the movie at all. And when they do have stuff involving dinosaurs, it's somehow not even interesting. Every single action set piece, if you can call them that, feels weightless and without stakes, and it's painfully obvious that every important character is functionally invincible. Nobody dies, nobody even gets seriously injured. All the dinosaurs seem like they're giving characters sporting chances to run, or hide, or climb a ladder, or take a fucking smoke break instead of actually killing them. The Giganotosaurus, the one that the director said was like the Joker because it just wants to watch the world burn, literally the only thing it kills in this movie is like two locusts that are already on fire. This is sort of intertwined with the fact that, despite the fact that the basic premise of the movie is that dinosaurs have been released upon the world at large and have propagated all over the globe, the majority of this film still takes place in yet another fucking dinosaur park. They can't even manage the barest modicum of originality before stumbling back to cheap nostalgia and retreaded scenarios. Speaking of which, this movie brings back every legacy character it can get its hands on. Grant and Sattler are back, but they don't do anything. They're just brand signifiers. They're an optical illusion, so your brain tricks itself into remembering Jurassic Park, an actually good movie. They're not the only returning nostalgic landmarks either. Henry Wu is back, like I mentioned earlier, and Dodson is too, as the main antagonist, no less. It's just so obviously manufactured to make people point and go, look, the guy! Even the ending basically apes the original. I was fortunate enough to watch the original Jurassic Park in my local theater this year as part of a weekly flashback cinema thing that they do. I'm really glad I did, because otherwise I might have come to the conclusion that the franchise was never good, that these sequels suck so bad because they were built on a faulty foundation. But that's simply not it. I think some amount of blame can be leveled at Steven Spielberg for the state of modern blockbusters, but the amount of soul and humanity in his films massively outstrips this insipid cash grab. Spielberg makes movies because they're the only way he knows how to articulate the love he has for life and people. Colin Trevorrow makes movies because an executive who's never seen mud before hands him a bunch of money and tells him to. I'm not above embracing cheap nostalgia for the sake of franchises I love, and the fact that this movie was so bad it made me worry Jurassic Park might no longer be one of those franchises is maybe the most damning thing I can say about it.
Number 105, it's they slash them, baby.
This movie's title is the punchline to a corny Tumblr text post, and that's pretty much the best thing it has going for it. There's no other way to describe this movie for me than offensive. I really hesitate to use that word because it so often feels like a cudgel in internet discussions to dunk on sensitive snowflakes for being too delicate to appreciate good media or whatever the hell, but it's the only word I can think of to properly summarize my emotions towards this film. It's not a totally asinine premise. The slasher genre is already one pretty thoroughly defined by regressive sex and violence, and taking the classic summer camp setting and twisting it into a conversion camp is, theoretically, an interesting way to tell a modern queer horror narrative. But the thing is, conversion camps are real, actual things that exist in a much more tangible and sinister way than a regular slasher guy. It cannot just be careless set dressing. These things need to be handled with respect. Jason Voorhees is more or less a mythological kind of horror, but people like the counselors in this movie absolutely exist, which makes it aggravating that the moral the film settles on in its final moments is a kind of we're better than them speech about rising above your abusers. With how much of this movie is spent showing queer people suffering, it feels insulting to cap the whole thing off with a moral grandstand about respectability and nonviolence. Lead brain messaging aside, this movie just completely and utterly fails at being simply an interesting horror movie. The only people who actually die are the counselors, who are basically objectively evil. We're supposed to want them to die, so there's nothing horrifying about them getting slashered. It doesn't even really show us the violence either. It's perfectly happy to give us an extended electroshock scene to hammer home the homophobic violence thing, but when it's time for any of the actual abusers to die, it's like a silhouette of blood splattering on a wall. It's not scary, it's not thrilling, it's not even campy. I said this in my Texas Chainsaw Massacre review, but I'm willing to look past a lot of tastelessness and shitty production in slashers as long as the murders are interesting and gory. This is sanitized to the point that it almost makes me wonder if it's some kind of Daily Wire psyop. And to top the whole thing off, this has one of the most agonizing musical numbers ever recorded. Fucking Perfect by Pink. That's what all the young gays are listening to these days, right? We'll throw in a dance sequence to show that the characters are bonding, and it'll be set to the most manufactured empowerment song of all time. The only redeeming thing about this sludge is that it actually cast LGBT actors. And you know what? Given what they were working with, they were pretty solid performers.
Number 106, it's the bubble, baby.
Netflix original The Bubble is some of the worst schlock I've ever had the misfortune of watching. Just a complete piece of crap from top to bottom. If you've never heard of this movie, consider yourself lucky. As far as I can tell, it was on the Netflix front page for about a day before fucking off to some dark recess of their servers to suffer an undeath with the rest of their catastrophes. I'm actually almost tempted to not make this review because I don't want to expose folks who otherwise would never hear of it to this cognito hazard. And if a single person hears about and watches The Bubble because of this review, I feel like I should get sentenced to 30 days of community service or something. The plot of this movie follows the production of Cliff Beast 6, the most recent installment in a fairly successful dinosaur action franchise. Cliff Beast 6 is being made during the COVID-19 pandemic, which means that all of the actors and crew are isolated inside a hotel making the entire movie, an isolation known as being in a bubble. The bubble follows all the actors, crew members, and executives as they become more and more frustrated with the pandemic, the working conditions, and each other. The characters are all unlikable assholes. The plot meanders all over the goddamn place. Nothing is relevant for more than a few scenes. The pace grinds to a halt so that the characters can do a TikTok dance multiple times. And the comedy is just unbelievably unfunny. There's something a lot of comedy movies have been doing recently that I'm really not fond of, which is leaning on the actors to improvise comedic scenes in lieu of carefully crafted jokes. Now, don't get me wrong. I respect and appreciate improv comedy. It can be hilarious when done by talented artists, and there are a lot of great movies that have been mostly improvised, like Borat, and This Is Spinal Tap. The benefit of improv comedy in movies is that it lets the actors riff and bounce off each other until the final cut ends up being a greatest hits montage of all the best jokes they come up with. The downside is that if none of those jokes are that funny, or if the actors aren't that funny, or if all the actors are funny and keep trying to one-up each other, you're left with hours upon hours of unusable footage, and you don't even have a good scene to show for it. For my money, I think that a tightly written script with carefully crafted jokes is typically better for a movie format than a loose script with room for improv. But that's just one of the hundreds of problems with this film, though. I could talk for legitimately an hour about how much this movie sucks, because it inspires a righteous flame in my stomach that very few movies have managed to ignite. If you like this movie, for whatever reason, please leave a comment explaining why, because I'm genuinely curious. You should probably also ask your doctor to scan your brain for tumors, since I hear they can impair judgment. Well, that's it. Every single 22 release I saw. I know that plenty of stuff slipped through the cracks. There's quite a few movies that I meant to watch, but ultimately never got around to, which is unfortunate, but if I ever want to watch older films, there's no feasible way to watch every single new movie I'm vaguely interested in, too. If you'd like, you can comment with your favorite releases of the year that don't appear on the list, and I'll make an effort to work them into my watch list. This really was a good year for film. I mean, realistically, every year is a good year for film if you make the effort to watch more than just the stuff that hits your local Cinemark, but even the mainstream stuff this year was mostly good. It really felt like all the stuff that was cooking during the pandemic finally released all at once, and we got 3 years worth of good blockbusters in a single summer. Even beyond the screens of the local movie megaplex, though, I made an effort to watch more international film this year than I have historically, and that was a worthwhile endeavor that I'd like to continue in future years. I'd like to reiterate and reinforce the fact that these are my own opinions. I'm not a professional critic. This video is made as a hobby project. I'm not remotely interested in trying to influence other people's opinions. This is entirely an exercise in documenting my own thoughts. If you got something out of it, whether that be an interesting recommendation or a new insight on a movie you've already seen, then I'm glad. That means this video accomplished more than its goal. And with that, I think I've said everything I mean to say about the films I saw in 22. If you made it this far, good lord, you sat through a lot of me talking. Don't forget to tune in eventually for my 23 year in review. Have a good one, y'all.